Does this fine-tuning exist in the universe? It really does. The strength of the laws of physics is determined by the relatively small number of so-called fundamental constants. You can see two examples of such constants in the equations below. First is the gravitational constant. It is a capital G on the left equation, which describes the gravitational force between the two masses, m1 and m2, located at a distance of r from each other. Second is the speed of light, c, in the famous Einstein equation between energy and mass on the right. As we can see, in both cases, there is a strong dependence between the values of the fundamental constants and the strength of the corresponding law. The word fundamental means that these constants cannot be derived from any other laws. Their numerical values are given from above, and we can only measure them experimentally. The strong dependence of the laws of nature from the fundamental constant values raises the very important question: is the structure of the universe stable to variation in fundamental constants? Is the equilibrium of the universe stable or unstable to these variations? On the picture at the top of this slide, you can see two kinds of equilibrium. Case one is a stable equilibrium, like a ball on the bottom of the pit. If we push the ball to either side, it will return to the original position. And if it is the case with the universe, changing the fundamental constants by a small amount will not significantly change the universe structure. Case two is a non-stable equilibrium, like a ball on top of the hill. There is an equilibrium in this case, but it is unstable. If we push the ball to either side, it will fall and will not return to its original position. If this is the case with the universe, changing the fundamental constants by a small amount will cause a dramatic change in the universe structure. For a long time, scientists assumed that the structure of the universe is stable to the variations of these constants. But the result of the studies performed at the first half of the 20th century, which was unexpected for many scientists, was that our universe is very unstable to such variations. The numerical values of these fundamental constants are fine-tuned to provide the complex structure of the universe we see. I would like to present only several examples of this fine-tuning, which are the origin of carbon, relationship between gravitational and electromagnetic forces, masses of the proton and neutron, and strong interactions and proton-proton reaction. And the last example will be Earth in a habitable zone of the sun. First is the origin of carbon. Carbon is a stable element forming the chemical framework of life on Earth. It is the basis of all organic molecules. It turns out that its existence is a result of amazing coincidence, fine-tune of the so-called nuclear resonance, which makes possible the formation of carbon in thermonuclear reactions, triple helium reaction in the star cores. This reaction starts when two alpha particles, nuclei of the helium atoms, fuse with each other and form the beryllium nucleus. In common conditions, the collision of this beryllium nucleus with the other alpha particle would not lead to the fusion reaction. Particles just bounce off each other. But in a very narrow interval of particles' energy, the nuclear resonance would occur, which leads to the fusion reaction and birth of carbon. And you know what? The energies inside the star cores are just what are needed for triple helium reaction to occur. Moreover, the other reaction is also possible. The nuclear fusion between the newborn carbon nucleus and another helium nucleus, which leads to the formation of oxygen. But in this case, the nuclear resonance occurs at slightly lower than necessary energy level, which suppresses the reaction and preserves carbon. It was calculated that if the resonant level of carbon were just 4% lower, or the resonant level of oxygen were just 1% higher, there would be no carbon in the universe in the framework of the Big Bang. Is it just coincidence? Famous astrophysicist who positioned himself as an agnostic, Fred Hoyle, wrote about this coincidence. If you wanted to produce carbon and oxygen in roughly equal quantities by stellar nucleosynthesis, there are the two levels you would have to fix, and your fixing would have to be just about where these levels are actually found to be. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Second example is a relationship between gravitational and electromagnetic forces. Electromagnetic force is 10 power 40 times bigger than the force of gravity. The ratio between the gravitational and electromagnetic forces, which is 10 power minus 40, is tiny, but plays a very important part in the life of stars. If this ratio were less, all stars would be red dwarfs. If this ratio were bigger, all stars would be blue giants. In either case, it would lead to the absence of sun-like stars in the universe. Next example of fine-tuning is the fine-tuning of the masses of proton and neutron. Protons and neutrons are the building blocks of any atomic nucleus, except a hydrogen nucleus which contains only one proton and no neutrons. The masses of the proton and neutron can also be regarded as the fundamental constants. The relationship between them makes possible the existence of all chemical elements in the universe. If the mass of a neutron were just 1% higher, less than 1% higher than its actual value, neutrons inside the atomic nuclei of most chemical elements would be unstable. If the mass of a proton were just 0.2% higher than its present value, protons would be unstable and the existence of hydrogen would be impossible. The same is true if the masses were lower. Thus, both increasing and decreasing these masses would result in the absence of chemical elements in the universe. Next example is strong interaction and proton-proton reaction. It turns out that the possibility of proton-proton nuclear reaction, which is the main source of the sun's energy, strongly depends on the strength of the strong nuclear interaction. The strong nuclear force binds the proton and neutron together in atomic nucleus. Here is a picture which shows the proton-proton reaction. Two protons make a deuterium nucleus which interacts with additional proton and makes helium-3. Interaction with an additional helium-3 nucleus produces the helium-4 or conventional helium. If the strong force was a little, just 5% smaller, it would lead to the absence of deuterium, so the proton-proton reaction would stop at the first stage. If the strong force was a little, just 2% bigger, it would lead to the existence of diproton, the bound states of the two protons. And in this case, the first part of the proton-proton reaction would proceed unimaginably faster, 10 power 18 times faster, which would lead to the starless universe and at the present time. Stars were burned out completely during the very short period of time. The last example I would like to show is simpler, and it is connected with our own planet. We are very lucky to live on a planet which is located on the habitable zone of our star, the Sun. Habitable zone is the zone in the planetary system where water can exist in a liquid state, which is crucial for the existence of life. If the radius of the Earth's orbit or the luminosity of the Sun were slightly different, life on Earth would be impossible. We have considered only several examples of fine-tuning of the universe, but there are many more such examples. Who or what is responsible for this fine-tuning? In general, there are two possible answers to this question. It was made by chance or by purpose. If the former is true, we can estimate the probability of such fine-tuning event occurring just by chance. The probability that this fine-tuning event will happen simply by accident is estimated. One of the estimation is 10 power minus 10 power 123. This number is indescribably small and simply means nothing or impossible. So the fine-tuning of the universe couldn't occur just by chance. The probability of this chance is simply zero. Thus, we have to seriously consider the intelligent design and the great intelligence behind it. As Fred Hoyle wrote once, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. I think we have seen today that he had the very good reasons to write this phrase. Maybe it's time for all of us to pay a very close attention to the first phrase in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Thank you for your attention.
I think that now we are ready for people to type in questions for you to answer if people had some questions about your talk. Can you hear me okay, Alexey?
Yes, I'm hearing you.
Maybe I will start off with an oral question while people are thinking of written questions that they can enter in the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen. I've heard about the anthropic principle, and I'm wondering if you could comment about the anthropic principle and its relation to the issue of fine-tuning.
Okay, so anthropic principle is closely related to the explanation of the universe fine-tuning. All the explanations we have today are given in scope of this principle. There are several variants of the formulation of this principle, but we can emphasize two of them, which is in principle include all others. And these variants are named as strong and weak anthropic principle. Strong anthropic principles state that the universe must be such as to admit the creation of observers within it at some stage. So it assumes that there is some fundamental cause for existing of the fine-tuning of the universe, fundamental cause for us to exist. Of course, it sounds very like as the intelligent design, if you assume that this fundamental cause is the intelligent designer. In this sense, the strong anthropic principle is close to the biblical creation, although one can assume the other still unknown sources of this fundamental cause within the scope of the laws of nature without any intelligent intervention. The second variant, the weak anthropic principle, states that we must be prepared, one of the formulation of this principle, we must be prepared to take account of the fact that our location in the universe is necessarily privileged to the extent of being compatible with our existence as observers. Generally, it states that our existence is a result of the fact that our location in the universe is privileged to the extent of being compatible with our existence. It means that this fine-tuning is a result of coincidence. We are simply very lucky to live in the location where the environment is compatible with our existence. In this scope, the fine-tuning is a result of the lucky accident, chance. But we already saw that the probability of this lucky accident is simply zero. So how can we overcome this great limitation? And the most accepted hypothesis now is the multiverse hypothesis. So
Good. Thank you very much. I see we have several comments and questions here. One person says, thank you for your illustrations. They appreciated those. Another person is wondering whether it would be possible to get a copy of the presentation. They're French speaking and they would like to see it again. And I would direct them to the Geoscience Research Institute booth. And I believe there will be a place there where you can click on a link and you will be able to find all of the presentations that are being given in relation to the Geoscience Research Institute. A couple other questions that I see here, and you can pick them if you're interested in talking about them. One person says, is the earth round or flat, as some people pretend? So I don't know whether you'd like to address the flat earth idea or not. If not, I can go on to the next one,
it's frequent question in these presentations. I think the earth is round.
Okay.
And one of the reasons, I mean, for me, maybe the main reason is that if you know that the Earth rotating around its axis, and the rotation, we can see this rotation by observe the rotation of the stars, of the constellations. And these rotations, of course, it's rotated around some imaginable axis. And this axis have two poles. And you can see, for example, in northern hemisphere, you can see the North Pole. It's very close to this famous star, the Polaris or polar star. And if you travel from north to south, you can see that this location of the North Pole, North Celestial Pole, the altitude of this pole will decline when you travel south, and it will be right on the horizon when you cross the equator. And then when you will be at the southern hemisphere, you will not see North Pole, but you can see the South Pole. Unfortunately, in southern hemisphere, there is no a bright star near the South Celestial Pole. But you can see that there is some some place in the celestial sphere where this pole is located, around which all the stars are rotating. And also you can see that the picture of the star or the stars of the constellations are changing when you travel south. And you can see the constellations which you cannot see in the northern hemisphere. And I do not think it can be described in the scope of flat Earth. You can describe it only if you assume that the Earth is, round. The Earth is a rotating sphere. So one of the arguments, which you can easily, check with your eyes.
Okay, so there's actually a number of evidences for the Earth being round, and you've suggested several of them. So, okay, good, thank you. Here's another question that somebody typed in. They said, what is the multiverse hypothesis, and what kind of comments do you have about the multiverse?
Yeah, that's important because we already mentioned this as a weak anthropic principle, and the multiverse hypothesis is one of the, maybe the main explanation of this weak anthropic principle. This is the idea that multiple universes exist, having all possible combinations of characteristics, and we inevitably find ourselves within a universe that allows us to exist. But considering the almost zero probability of the fine-tuning, we definitely can replace the phrase multiple universes to infinite number of the universes. There are theories which predict the existence of the multiverse. For example, the many-world interpretation of quantum mechanics developed by Hugh Everett, or the chaotic inflation by Andrei Linde. But from my point of view, the present popularity of the multiverse is mostly based on the fact that materialistic science wants to have a theory to support the weak anthropic principle. And the multiverse hypothesis is chosen to be such a theory. But are there the weak points or difficulties related to the multiverse? They definitely are. First, and maybe main problem with this theory is that there are no experimental evidences of the multiverse hypothesis. There is no scientific proof of the existence of the universes other than our universe. Second, we already mentioned that to explain the universe fine-tuning through the weak anthropic principle, we need multiverse not as many universes, but as infinite number of the universes, in which any possible combination of fundamental constants realizes in one of the universes. And the multiverse hypothesis in this form bring a difficulty from my point of view with the falsification principle formulated by Karl Popper. This very important principle in science states that the hypothesis is scientifically valid only when we can perform the experiment which can potentially falsify this hypothesis, potentially show that this hypothesis is invalid. But in multiverse, which includes any combination of fundamental constants, any possible hypothesis can realize in one of the infinite number of the universes, which makes falsification principle generally and globally meaningless. I would like to cite famous astrophysicist Paul Davies, who wrote in his book The Accidental Universe about the multiverse hypothesis. It may seem doubtful that nature should condone such wasteful repetition. Is it possible to believe, and you should know this word, to believe, in innumerable universes that exist but have never been observed and serve no other purpose than to ensure the probability that somewhere among the vast multiple of them a knowable word occasionally arises? To explain coincidences by referring to the infinity of useless universes is like carrying an unnecessary cargo over a long distance. Of course, one can believe, remember this word, can believe in multiverse hypothesis, but I personally prefer to believe in intelligent design. It sounds much more reasonable and logical for me.
Thank you, Alexey. That's fascinating. The multiverse idea has been around for a while and in various forms. So thank you for giving some details about that. Here's another question about the Big Bang. How can we use the fact that the universe is expanding as an evidence of the creation and not of the Big Bang? And maybe as part of that, what you could make some comments about what the pros and cons of the Big Bang theory are.
Mm-hmm. If you are thinking about Big Bang theory, you should know that there are some advantages in the Big Bang theory. First, it showed that the universe has a beginning. It's not eternal. It's very important, fact, or not fact, but very important assumption of the Big Bang theory. The other important advantage is that in this theory, we must assume that at the very beginning, there was time when the present laws of physics not acted or acted differently from the present time. So cosmologists call this period of time the time of singularity. And as I said during the presentation, the Big Bang theory requires the fine-tuning of the fundamental constants. And this fact was one of the causes which bring attention to the fact of the fine-tuning of the universe. But of course, there are the significant disadvantages of this theory. Maybe the biggest disadvantage is our lack of understanding of the nature of singularity, lack of understanding of the inner causes which led to the Big Bang event. We do not understand how everything came out from nothing. Important to mention is that we also have a lack of understanding of the process of inflation. And we do not know in terms of science who or what made the fine-tuning of the universe. I think if you are thinking about the Big Bang in general, it's an interesting theory, but it would be dangerous, I think, for us to accept this as a truth or as scientifically proven. There are many discussions today inside the scientific community about the validity of this theory, so we also do not take this theory as a fact. But it should not prevent us from the serious attention to some parts of this theory which can be useful, for example, the fine-tuning which we are talking about. What about the expansion of the universe? Well, it can point us to the Big Bang, but we can consider the Big Bang as the creation event also. So we have a serious arguments for this expansion of the universe, but there are many theories which can show us the cause of this expansion other than Big Bang. So now it's, even in the naturalistic scientific community, the Big Bang theory now is in question. There are many questions about it.
Here's one that's asking about the solar system, the origin of the solar system, but also what you commented about the habitable zones. They say the Earth exists in the habitable zone of our star, the sun. So do you think that it is reasonable that, given that there are many trillions of stars in the universe and that they too must have habitable zones, that there could be other planets in the habitable zones of some of those stars? Hence, there is other life in the universe. So a little bit about our own solar system in the habitable zone, and about its origin, and about other habitable zones around other stars.
Okay, yes, of course, we know for sure for now that there are many planets around other stars. So it's observable now with our astrophysical methods. And of course, even if you look at the known planets, some of them are in the habitable zone of their stars. So in this regard, there is a possibility that these planets have a life on it. But the life is a very complex, question. And if the planet is in the habitable zone of its stars, it's of course it is necessary for life to exist. But it's this is not it's not the only condition to life for life to exist. So there are numerous, infinite number of conditions which should be on this planet for life to exist. So this is only one. This is only one of the many conditions for life to exist. If you're asking about origin of the solar system, so the main class of hypotheses which describe the origin of the solar system and the other planetary system as well is a so-called nebular hypothesis, in the scope of the Big Bang. So this hypothesis suggests that the solar system was formed from the enormous cloud of gas and dust called protoplanetary nebula, which gives the name to the hypothesis. But there are many questions to this hypothesis, which include, for example, the formation of the so-called planetesimals, the tiny embryos of the future planet. It is unknown how the particles with size about 1 centimeter in the protoplanetary disk can form the planetesimals approximately 1 kilometer in size. It also looks like that the mass of protoplanetary disk is too small for the planet formation. Maybe you know that 99.9% of the solar system mass is inside the sun, is inside the star, and only 0.1% of the solar system mass is in the planets. And Another important issue here is that the angular momentum of the planets contains 98% of the whole solar system angular momentum, and the sun carries only 2% of the angular momentum. But as I said before, it contains 99.9% of the solar system mass. So in the nebular hypothesis, the situation should be opposite. So we have to consider some mechanism to transfer the angular momentum from sun to planets. Another interesting fact is that two planets, Venus and Uranus, rotating around their axis in the opposite direction to the direction of rotation of these planets around the sun, which also can be described in the nebular hypothesis. I should say that in the planetary theory, there are many unanswered questions today. The number of questions is much bigger than the number of answers, for sure.
Okay, I see there's another couple questions that follow up on that. And I think they would also be related to the origin of the solar system, but they're related to water. One person has asked a couple questions about water. One, he says, thank you very much for the presentation. And his question is, what can be the origin of the waters that were before God started the creation of the earth? Was it the H2O water formula? And then he says, God bless. So that's one of the questions. But I think the other question is also related to it. He says, thanks for the brilliant presentation. What is the H2O water chemical formula? So I'm not sure I understand what he's asking here, but something about the significance of the water formula giving unique properties to water, perhaps. The unique properties of water are essential for life to exist. So the origin of water and as well as the unique properties of water.
So about unique properties, I'm not a chemist, so I'm a physicist. And I can repeat your statement that the properties of the water molecule is very interesting, and these properties is very important for life to exist. But what about the origin? It's very interesting question, because I touched this question when I describe the origin of carbon, for example. So what is the origin of chemical elements heavier than helium or heavier than oxygen? Is it Big Bang process? Is it thermonuclear reaction? Because in the scope of Big Bang theory, the origin of the elements heavier than helium is the result of thermonuclear reaction inside the star cores. I mentioned the origin of carbon. And of course, there is a question, do we believe that the origin of carbon or any other heavy elements in the universe are from the star cores, are from the thermonuclear reaction? I do not know. My personal, and I think nobody knows on Earth, at least. My personal opinion that, of course, the most probable that most of the amount of the heavy element heavier than helium was created by God during the creation process. But maybe some small, can we exclude the possibility that some amount of the element heavier than hydrogen was produced in the thermonuclear reaction? Maybe this is also the source of producing of such elements. I mean, there's a natural source of producing it, but maybe not the only, maybe not the main source, but some of the sources. So the present, as I said, the present interpretation, the present theory in the scope of the Big Bang is the thermonuclear reaction, but we do not know. Maybe this is the one of the source.
I think maybe these discussions about the origin of the universe and the origin of the solar system that you've so nicely explained leads to a question that I see we have here about, is the universe old or young? Is the solar system old or young? Is the earth old or young? And how do Adventists relate to those issues? There are some evangelicals, some creation groups who consider the entire universe to be young. There's different opinions about it in Adventist circles. I don't know whether you'd like to address that a little bit about ages for different parts of the universe.
Yeah, this is a mostly theological question, of course, not scientific questions. The simple answer is we do not know. Because we do not have complete information in the Bible about the age of the universe. We have a complete information about the age of life on Earth in the Bible, but it tells mostly nothing about the age of the universe. There are many theories, as you mentioned already. For example, the passive gap theory, which is, I think, most accepted in our community, in Adventist community, which puts some gap between the first two verses in the Bible and the rest of the Genesis 1. So in this case, the universe can be old, maybe, or older than the life on Earth. Who knows? So we can consider any possibility here.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a variety of opinions and approaches to that. So you stated that very well. Related to that is the concept of when God created light. And depending on whether you have an older universe or a young universe, you have different opinions about light and when it was created and so forth. So one person asks the question here. He says, the question I have is the concept of time, the idea that God created light on the first day. So I don't know whether you have any comments about light and when it was created, how it was created. And I suppose that's related to another question, the Doppler effect and the redshift and so forth. So maybe you can talk a little bit about light related to those concepts.
So the first light we see in the universe is a so-called cosmic microwave background. So that's the remnant of the epoch when the matter and the energy were separated. In scope of the Genesis 1, the light was created the first day, but as Ben said already, we do not know which kind of light. It depends from our opinion about the age of the universe. It can be sun's light if we consider this passive gap theory. So the sun in this theory, the sun was already there when the Earth was created, and the light at the first day just can be the sunlight. But maybe we have some, some obstacles in the atmosphere of the Earth, and the observer on the surface observer on the surface of the Earth just couldn't see the sun as a star, but he can see the light of the sun. One of the possibilities. Many theologians think that this is the light which comes directly from God. So it's also the possibility. It's also the open question for us. We do not have enough information in the Bible, and the science cannot provide you the complete answer. It's just many hypotheses, and you can choose one of them which you like most.
I think this suggests to me that God knows a lot more than we do, and we can come up with some ideas, but there's various possible ways that even we can envision God might have done some of this. Here's a bit of a philosophical question. As you talk about the fine tuning, you suggest that this indicates a fine tuner, somebody who tuned the universe to be have a place that life could exist. So here's a question. They say, why is it that some people don't believe in God as the source of this fine tuning? So they say, given all the assessment of constants that you mentioned, why do you think that Stephen Hawking was an atheist? And why do you think that Neil deGrasse Tyson is an agnostic?
As I said, there is an explanation. It's not an explanation, I mean, there's not complete explanation, this anthropic principle. But many of the scientists believe in the multiverse theory, which we already discussed. So there are infinite number of universes and in these universes, all combinations of the fundamental constants are realized. I mean, and in one of the universe, because the chance of this is very small, it's simply it's very close to zero, as we see from the presentation. But maybe in one of the universe, this coincidence happened, and and we are living in this universe. So many scientists believe in that, and this is important word, believe. They do not know, but they believe. Another possibility for them, I mean, for the scientists who do not want to believe in God and intelligent design, is a strong anthropic principle in a form which excludes the intelligent designer. So they think that there is some fundamental cause other than God, other than intelligent designer in the universe, which cause this fine-tuning. But the problem is we do not know this cause. We do not know, at least for now, which can provide this fine-tuning in the universe. But of course, they believe in this. So we believe in God. They believe in the other reasons. But the situation now is that we do not see and do not have a scientifically proof for any reasons to the fine-tuning. So it's a matter of believing.
Here is another question about dark matter that I think you might have some insights into. So the question starts off, good evening and thank you for this awesome presentation. Can you point to any biblical or extra biblical references to the recent findings that most of the universe is composed of dark matter? So anyway, it's just some comments about dark matter and how does this fit into the scenario, the standard scenario, or some kind of scenario related to the Bible?
So I do not know any biblical, verses which states that the dark matter exists. But we have very, serious results from the observation, because the dark matter have a gravitational influence to the visible matter, and we see this influence, and we can even measure the mass of this dark matter. What is the source of this dark matter? What is the nature of this dark matter? It is still unknown. So it's this is one of the question which I'm studying in my professional work, because I'm a physicist, I'm a high energy physicist, and many experiments now are are performed to find some particles, some unknown particles, which is massive or from one side, and does not interact with other particles. But for now we do not find these particles. So the search is proceeding, and I hope that we will find the source of the dark matter. It plays a very important role in the modern scenarios of the Big Bang. And I do not, as I said, we do not have any evidences from the Bible, so it's a question beyond the Bible. And Bible doesn't say that dark matter doesn't exist, and it doesn't say that the dark matter is existing. So that's again, this is a question for future studies.
Okay, thank you. I will make a couple comments now. One person said there's no sound, and I'm wondering whether that's only for this one person. So if there are other people who don't have sound, maybe you could make a comment on the Q&A. Another one says, I am late. Will this presentation be available online? So I'll comment again. If you go to the Geoscience Research Institute website, I believe that there will be links to these presentations from the Geoscience Research Institute website, so that you can look at that. Okay, we got a lot of comments here that there is sound, so it sounds like maybe that was just one person that was having problems with the sound, so thank you very much for that. Another comment, people say there's Creation Ministries International. If you are interested in looking at that, they have some comments about these topics. The website is creation.com.
I know about it.
So that is one source of information in addition. I know that some people may have questions about cosmic inflation. I think you may have briefly mentioned about that, but is there anything else you'd like to say about cosmic inflation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because the cosmic inflation is a very important part of the modern Big Bang theory. It is a theory of exponential expansion of space in the early universe, which took place in the very beginning of the Big Bang, just right after the singularity. This expansion led to the enormous rise of the volume of the universe during the tiny time interval. It expanded by 10 power 22 or 26 times, or even bigger. Why this hypothesis is necessary in the Big Bang theory? The main reasons are the so-called horizon problem and the flatness problem. In the original Big Bang theory, without inflation, these problems were probably the biggest problems of the theory. The horizon problem is the problem of determining why the universe appears statistically isotropic in accordance with so-called cosmological principle. When we look at the universe, we see that matter and energy distribute mostly uniformly through the space, at least at the large scales. And usually the uniformity of matter or energy distribution is a result of interaction between the matter or light in different spatial regions. But during the Big Bang, there were numerous regions of space which could not interact with each other because the speed of light is finite, and this is the fastest speed for transmitting interactions in space. And because of this, we would have to see a big non-uniformity in the universe, which we do not actually see. When we put the inflation hypothesis, in this case, the initially very small region of space, which was in equilibrium, inflated to the very big size, like the size of the whole visible universe. With this, equilibrium was conserved, and thus the uniformity was conserved also, which solves the horizon problem. And the flatness problem, the second problem, is the problem of the very fine tuning of the density of matter and energy in the early universe. This density affects the curvature of the space-time. We see today that the curvature is very close to the flat universe. But the calculations show that it requires the very precise tuning of the space-time curvature in the early universe. The precision of this fine-tuning should be enormous, approximately 10 power minus 60. But if the inflation took place, the enormous expansion of the space-time made it almost flat anyway. after the end of inflation. Thus, there is no need for such a fine-tuning of the curvature parameter in this case. Okay, all of this is good, but was inflation really took place in the early universe? Is it simply mathematical theory, or it has the experimental confirmation? I think, and not only me who thinks similarly, that this hypothesis has a very serious problems which lead to the questions about its validity. First problem is the source of the nature of force caused the inflation. It should be very strange type of energy, or very strange type of force, which density would not decrease when the space-time increased, but this density should remain constant. For now, we do not show such kind of energy, so the source of inflation.
Dr. Popov, I think we are almost out of time.
Oh, okay.
I just want to make sure that I thank you very much for the presentation. There are a couple other questions which I don't think we're going to get to, so I'll mention them, but I think probably we will get cut off in the middle of your answering them. But anyway, thank you very much for your presentation. And in the Q&A, I noticed many people were very appreciative of what you said. So if we have another 30 seconds, there's some questions about string theory and Ed Witten's work. There's also questions about the black hole. So I don't know whether you want to.
Yeah,
I think we may get cut off, but if you want to talk about that.
Maybe about string theory, because we have a short time.
Okay.
The string theory, for now, it's pure mathematical theory. We do not have any experimental evidences. So it's very interesting mathematical model, but not more than that.
Okay.
So, and I would like to just to say a few words about the inflation. The second problem of this theory is that we also do not have any experimental evidences of the inflation. So it's also the mathematical theory now. It explains the horizon and flatness problem, but this is just one of the explanation which for now does not confirm experimental.
Okay. Did you want to make any comment about black holes, or
what comment? What is the question?
Okay, the question is, why are there black holes in the universe? Is it possible to have other life existing in other galaxies? So it's two separate questions, I think.
Okay, first, we do not know exactly what is the purpose of the black holes, but definitely there is a purpose, because we see the supermassive black holes almost in any galaxy, in the center of any galaxies which we see in the universe. So it should play some important role in the galaxy's life. But for now, we do not have an explanation what is this role. So we know that it's very important, but we do not know why it is very important.
I think maybe we should finish, because I think we're going to get cut off. But once again, thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Popov. And if people are interested, they can go to the Geoscience Research Institute. And I think there's a link there that they will be able to look at it again and see the discussion. So thank you very much. And I think we will finish with that.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, watching this presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'll be wrapping up this program in just 1 minute.
still my soul, be still my soul, your good will undertake. To guide the future as He has the past. Your hope, your confidence, let nothing shake. All the mysterious shall be bright at last, be bright at last. Be still, my soul, the ways and ways we still know. His voice will rule them while we dwell below. Be still, my soul, be still, my soul.
Institute. In today's presentation, we will reflect about our planet, considering data acquired from scientific investigation and interfacing it with the biblical perspective. So, is the Earth special? That's the question in the title of this presentation. The opinions on this differ. For example, in their book, The Privileged Planet, Gonzalez and Richards build a case for our planet not only being exquisitely fit to support life, but also fit to give us the best view of the universe, as if Earth were designed both for life and scientific discovery. Now, in another influential book, Ward and Brownlee refrain from using the concept of design and adopt a naturalistic model of Earth history. However, they also come to the conclusion that the Earth is probably to be considered special or rare, as the title of their book suggests, because they suggest that complex life is less pervasive in the universe than is commonly assumed. Finally, we can also consider a different point of view. In his book on planetary climates, Andrew Ingersoll concludes the book with a statement that presents yet another view which minimizes Earth's uniqueness. Earth seems to be a typical planet orbiting a typical star with a typical collection of raw materials that constitute the building blocks of life. There is no reason to believe we are alone. So in a certain sense, we see that there is this spread of understandings and postures when it comes to the Earth as a planet that can host life. Is this something unique and special or not? Well, from a scientific perspective, a new way to more directly investigate the question of how special the Earth is has opened in the relatively recent past with the discovery of exoplanets. Exoplanets are planets outside the solar system. And although their existence had been postulated earlier, their detection only occurred starting from the 1990s. And there are several ways of detecting exoplanets, but two are the most common. With this animation, we can begin to look at the first one, which is known as the radial velocity method. Now, this detection method is based on the fact that if a planet orbiting a star is quite massive, the center of mass of the rotational system will be a little off the star, meaning that the star too will be wobbling around the center of mass. So as we observe this rotating system from the Earth in a radial direction, the electromagnetic waves coming from the star will be compressed or dilated as the star moves closer and farther, respectively, in its wobbly motion. So this shift in wavelength illustrated at the bottom of the animation will be periodical. And from it, one can estimate a minimum mass for the orbiting planet and also its distance from the star. Now, the second method, which we will see in this other animation, is the transit method. And this has been the most fruitful in the detection of exoplanets so far. And this is based on the fact that a planet transiting in front of a star will block some of the light that is received from an observer more or less aligned along the orbital plane. So that dip in luminosity, that drop that we see in the animation, will be greater if the planet's radius is larger because it will block more light. Also, the dip in luminosity will be observed periodically as the planet keeps revolving around the star, allowing to calculate the duration of a full revolution and the distance of the planet from the star. Now, one implication for both these detection methods, as we will see from the next slides, is that they are biased towards finding larger planets orbiting close to the star. But with the application of these and other methods of detection, we can see how the number of confirmed exoplanets has increased over time. Here we have several plots in a time series, and on the plot we have the duration of the orbital period or duration of the year in Earth days on the x-axis, and the mass of the planet in Earth masses on the y-axis. So notice that the scale is logarithmic in both axes. We can see that in the early years, detections were based mostly on the radial velocity method and included only very massive planets. But then, as we move through the years, we see that especially with data from the transit method, the catalog expanded to include planets with masses less than 10% of the Earth's mass. And with our most recent count in 2021, in excess of 4,300 confirmed exoplanets. Now, the plot does not show yet a real overlap with our planet Earth in terms of orbital period and mass. You can see that the confirmed exoplanets with similar or smaller mass are closer to their star, and the planets with similar or greater orbital period are more massive than the Earth. However, it is expected that with improvements in detection methods, this field will continue to be populated. Now, the discovery of exoplanets has allowed us to ask questions, many new questions, like, for example, what kind of stars have planets? How many stars do actually have planets? And how common are Earth-sized planets? Or is there a relationship between planet type and size and the distance from the star? Or what fractions of exoplanets are in the habitable zone? All these questions are being investigated, but one thing is already clear. The number and diversity of exoplanets is much larger than number and diversity of planets that we have so far known in our solar system. And as the catalog grew, it included also some unexpected surprises. For example, the occurrence of gas giants similar to our Jupiter, but orbiting very close to their star. Most importantly, the exoplanet census illustrates that the possible set of planetary types and conditions is vast, so that Earth-like conditions are not a default in the universe. Let's then review together some of the parameters that astrobiologists, who are the scientists who study the conditions necessary to sustain life in the cosmos, let's review the parameters that they are considering as important for a planet to be a good place for complex organisms like us to live on. Here is an example of a definition. You can see that in this definition, there are some key elements in the definition of habitability for a planet. First, we see the term mostly rock. So therefore, the planet should be a terrestrial planet, not a gaseous one. Also, a planet that can retain an atmosphere with certain specifications. Also, a planet that has availability of energy sources with certain specifications. And then a planet where liquid water is present. And finally, a planet that can keep these sets of parameters stable over time. Now, this is just one definition of habitability, but no matter the specifications chosen to define habitability, it is clear that habitability is not a function of one single variable, but lies at the intersection of multiple factors that have to coexist. So it's a much smaller subset of all the possible physical chemical conditions present in the cosmos. So let's then review more in detail some of the commonly recognized parameters from planetary habitability. Now, although there are possible sources of energy that could be used to sustain life originating from the interior of a planet, the most important source of energy is light from the star around which a planet is orbiting. It is not only crucial as a source of energy for living organisms, for example, on the Earth through the process of photosynthesis, but most crucially, it controls the possibility of having the right temperature for the availability of liquid water on the surface of the planet. Now, the temperature on the surface of a planet is a function of the distance of the planet from the star, among other parameters. So too close, and it will be too hot for liquid water to be a stable phase. Now, too far from the star, and we will reach the frost line, where water will turn into ice as the temperatures go below the freezing point. So this band or distance interval is called the Goldilocks zone or the habitable zone. And obviously, as you can see from the upper part of this illustration, the Earth is located within the habitable zone. Otherwise, we wouldn't have liquid water on its surface, right? Now, for a less massive star, like the one represented in the lower part of the figure, the habitable zone will be shifted closer to the star because of the smaller energy flux radiating from the star. Now, it turns out that not all stars are created equal. In our galaxy, stars less massive than the sun, like M stars at the top of this illustration, these stars are more abundant than sun-like G stars, which are represented at the bottom of the figure. So being less luminous, their habitable zone is located closer to the star. However, the M stars are also characterized by very high levels of emission of X-ray and ultraviolet radiation, actually up to hundreds times more intense radiation than what the Earth receives from the sun. Now, these energy flares and bombardment of high energy particles would affect the planets in the closely located habitable zone, making it difficult to preserve an atmosphere and also creating devastating effects for life. Moreover, at such close orbital range, a phenomenon which we will discuss later, which is called tidal locking, is also very likely to take place. And this would also decrease overall habitability. Therefore, even if there may be many planets in the habitable zone of a star, the kind of star and the type of radiation emitted are important parameters to consider for habitability. But why bothering so much about liquid water and even calling habitable the zone where temperatures are appropriate for the existence of liquid water on the surface of a planet? Well, we are all familiar with the fact that water is an important constituent of our bodies. What perhaps most of us do not realize is how intrinsic liquid water is to the life and metabolism of any living organism on Earth. As pointed out by Chaplin in a an excellent review paper, liquid water is not a beat player in the theater of life. It's the headline act. Liquid water is essential for the folding, the structure, the stability, and the activity of proteins. It also plays a part in proton and in electron transfer reactions. And it plays a part in the structuring of DNA and in the recognition of specific DNA sequences by proteins. And it's also essential for the metabolic activity in the cell. So in other words, liquid water is essential for the biochemistry of life. No liquid water, no life. Let's now consider another important parameter for habitability, the atmosphere. Well, the atmosphere of a planet is important for life, not only for respiration, but also for temperature regulation by trapping some of the heat radiated from the planet. And it also controls climate. It provides a shield against some of the damaging solar radiation. And also it interacts with the hydrosphere and the lithosphere for the cycling of elements important for life. Now, when a planet is too small,
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so sorry. We've got the wrong video up. This is Ronnie and Eileen, which will be coming on at 10 o'clock. We will begin the proper video for Ben Clausen now. And we'll play that through to its entirety, and as well as the Q&A afterwards. So we apologize for this error. And right now we have Ben Clausen coming up with the nature and the power of God.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be talking to you today about God's creation and his power that we see in nature and in human hearts. I'll be sharing with you online worldwide what I have shared in person to the ends of the earth. First, a bit of an introduction. I work in Loma Linda at the Geoscience Research Institute as part of the General Conference. The Institute has been tasked with studying God's second book of nature. But I should make it clear that it is not out to scientifically prove the Bible origin story correct. If that were the goal, one would end up disappointed, for God can do far beyond what human science can fathom. Our goal is to study nature from the perspective of God as its creator and to share the knowledge. One part is studying God's handiwork to see what he has to tell us about him and his power in nature. During the first 10 years at GRI, I did nuclear physics experiments, studying the very small things in nature, mainly at the Los Alamos lab, but at a number of other particle accelerators as well. Starting in about 2000, I realized that the Institute needed somebody studying geology more than physics. So for the last 20 years, I've been looking at geology issues. I started out by studying the granites here in Southern California, but the ones in Peru are similar. So since 2010, we have been looking at the granites in the foothills of the Andes. The question is, how fast do things happen in geology? Can you fit it all into a short time frame or not? The other part is sharing, organizing conferences that discuss science and religion, writing articles and books, maintaining a website, teaching classes about science and religion, and presenting lectures. There are now 4 scientists at the Institute, a biologist, a paleontologist, a geologist, and myself. They keep us traveling all the time, except for the past year with the pandemic. So for example, in 2018, I gave science and religion lectures in Mexico, Zambia, Peru, Bolivia, Chicago, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And we did field research in Zambia, Peru, Hawaii, and Mexico, and lab research at UCLA in the University of Arizona. An example of the field work is leading a geology field trip for the Geological Society of America here in Southern California in 2016. 4 of us led a 3-day field trip over a weekend to look at the granites. I was in charge on Friday, then skipped the part on Sabbath and rejoined the group on Saturday night. As a result of being gone, some of the other geologists in the group asked me about my church. Here are some examples of the lab work. We used a scanning electron microscope at California State University Northridge to look at some of the little tiny zircon minerals that we collected in Peru. You've heard of cubic zirconium. This is about the same thing, except really tiny. They are about as big as the thickness of your hair. Then we used a mass spectrometer at University of Arizona to zap these little tiny zircon grains with a laser beam to count the uranium and lead atoms and figure out how old the rock is. We have gone to the Arizona lab a half dozen times. Here is one grain showing beam spots with ages from 403 to 538 million years. So what do you do with those hundreds of millions of years ages? In other words, what if the research seems to indicate a long time? This is the issue that I have to deal with just about every day in my research. But this brings me to my big question. How do we go about making Jesus, Christianity, and Adventism meaningful and appealing to people in the scientific community, people within our technological society, and young and well-educated Seventh-day Adventists? I have found a better way than arguing about science and religion issues. People seem to expect that maybe we can display signs and wonders. That was why they came to Jesus. But Jesus said it was an evil and adulterous generation that seeks after a sign. What was it that Jesus gave them instead? I would suggest that it was the kind of person that he was. Just as Abraham and his descendants were to be a blessing to the world, Jesus' message was to preach good tidings to the meek, bind up the brokenhearted, and proclaim liberty to the captives. One of my favorite books is The Desire of Ages, where it says that Jesus went among them as one who desired their good. That is the framework within which I study and teach. The resulting lectures that I give are on many science topics, and one on Christianity about aiding the development of science. Then I give some lectures specifically about Christianity. One that a professor at Andrews University has asked me to give several times is my own personal walk with Jesus. Another is faith in spite of uncertainty. How do I continue to have faith in the Bible, even though I may not necessarily be able to scientifically prove that it is correct? Another on how to deal with the issue of evil. If we serve a totally good and a totally loving God, why do we see all the bad stuff in nature and in the world? And another one I give is nature and the power of God. This last lecture is the one I will share here. Nature, from the universe down to the atom, by powers of 10. As we look at these next 40 slides, keep in mind that this is God's dominion and displays his power. We will start with a 1 meter square, about 3 feet across, of flowers on a bush on the mall at Loma Linda University. If you back away a little bit, your field of view will expand from 1 meter to 10 meters across. You can now see the Good Samaritan sculpture and the university library in the background. Another factor of 10 larger to 100 meters across shows an aerial view of the mall, the administration building, and the Centennial Complex in the background. Another factor of 10 to a kilometer across uses Google Earth to display the campus of Loma Linda University. Another factor of 10 to 10 kilometers includes all of Loma Linda. Then 100 kilometers for the Inland Empire. Then 1,000 kilometers for California, and so forth. Next, we see North America on a scale of 10,000 kilometers. The last time I gave this presentation was in Tanzania. It takes about 20 hours to fly from California at 800 kilometers per hour, or 500 miles an hour. That's a long, long ways from home. As we move out into space, we first encounter communication satellites orbiting at about 40,000 kilometers. The moon's orbit is at about 400,000 kilometers from Earth. It took Apollo 13 about 4 days to return at 5,000 kilometers per hour. But it only takes 1 second for light to arrive here from the moon. Further out at 10 million kilometers, we see Earth's orbit around the sun. A factor of 10 further includes Mars and Venus. Next, we see Jupiter and the asteroid belt. In this picture, you can see the sun in the middle of the solar system. It takes about 8 minutes for light from the sun to reach us here on Earth. The next order of magnitude includes the outer planets in the entire solar system. We then move out to interstellar space. NASA communication with Voyager 1 beyond our solar system takes 10 hours, even at the speed of light. Our solar system is now but a dot. The Oort cloud is so far away that it takes a year for light to travel that far. Distance is now measured in light years, a distance of more than 1 trillion kilometers. As we move farther and farther away and faster, we pass the nearest stars, Alpha Centauri at about 4 light years. Many of the stars seen with the naked eye are within about 50 light years and constitute the numberless stars that Abraham saw. Stars within a sphere of 1,000 light years across include those in the Big Dipper. The Orion spiral arm of the Milky Way is about 10,000 light years across. The Milky Way itself is about 100,000 light years across and contains 1 trillion stars and a black hole at the center. Within 1 million light years is the local group of satellite galaxies in the Magellanic Cloud. The Virgo cluster of galaxies within 10 million light years includes the Andromeda Galaxy. Galaxy clusters form the local supercluster out to 100 million light years, which form the largest structures within 1 billion light years, and the visible universe within 10 billion light years. In the Standard Model, this universe is explained by inflationary cosmology that began about 14 million years ago. As I look at the large sizes of the solar system and galaxy and universe, it reminds me of a verse in Isaiah. Lift up your eyes on high, and behold who has created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name, by the greatness of his might, for he is strong in power, and not one faileth. Then I read in the Desire of Ages that God is in active communication with every part of his creation. How is he in active communication with the entire universe that takes billions of lights for light signals to travel from one side to the other? To give you a picture, let's talk about the story in Daniel chapter 9. We usually think about the 70-week prophecy near the end of this chapter. But before that, Daniel is praying for his people. It takes about 3 minutes to read the prayer. At the end of the prayer, an angel comes to Daniel. The angel says, "At the beginning of your prayer, I was commissioned by God to come to you." So it appears to take 3 minutes for the angel to come from heaven to Daniel. Now, how long does it take for light to reach us from the sun? It takes about 8 minutes. So either heaven is closer to us than the sun, or the angel traveled faster than the speed of light, or maybe there's some kind of a fourth dimension. In any case, it suggests that maybe there is a lot out there that's far beyond our understanding, that God's dominion is far beyond what we know. But God is also interested in the small. Jesus said that the very hairs of our head are numbered. These small sizes are where most of the range of light wavelengths are important. So we start back with the 1 meter square containing flowers in the Loma Linda University Mall. Let's say that one of these flowers has a bee on it. Looking closely, we see the bee's head. Closer, at 1 millimeter or 1,000 microns in size, we can see the eye of the bee with maybe some pollen on it. Pollen grains at less than 100 microns across are about the thickness of a human hair. A bacterium cell is less than 10 microns across. At 1 micron, we see a bacteria with viruses on it. A virus is less than 1/10 of a micron across, the same wavelength as visible light. Inside the virus is the DNA helix, visible with an electron microscope. The DNA is made up of molecular units. The molecular units are made up of atoms, each of which has an electron cloud. Inside the atomic electron cloud is mostly empty space. These sizes are the wavelength of gamma rays. Down to less than 1/1,000,000th of a meter, we can see the atomic nucleus, which contains protons and neutrons held together by the strong nuclear force. And even these protons contain smaller up and down quarks. With quarks, we've reached the detection limit at the small size, along with the force carriers. God's universe includes the very small as well as the very large. A few years ago, my dad asked me about a statement he had read. There are more molecules in a water drop than there are people on the earth. He asked me, is that really true? After a few calculations, I said, not only is that true, but there are more molecules in a drop of water than there are hairs on the heads of all the people on the earth. God keeps track of a lot of hair, but also a lot of molecules and atoms as well. As a nuclear physicist, I am reminded of God's power at the very small size inside the atom. The atom doesn't weigh very much, it doesn't have very much mass, m. But if you take that mass and multiply it by the speed of light, c, and then multiply it by the speed of light again, you can get a lot of energy out of it. E equals mc squared. A little bit of mass gives a lot of energy. So God's energy and power can be seen in the atom as well as the universe. Now I would like to talk about examples from the Bible, describing God's power in nature, how we have too small a picture of God, the best example of God's power, and what we as Christians and Seventh-day Adventists have to share about God's power. So, some examples. In Isaiah 55, God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. 1 Corinthians says, eye has not seen nor ear heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. And Romans says, God's eternal power and Godhead are clearly seen from the creation. In Job 38, in the next few chapters, we find God talking about nature. As you read through Job, you find that he had a lot of questions for God. He demanded to talk to him. But when God finally responded, Did he answer Job's questions? No. He just asked questions about nature. Chapter after chapter, where God asks him questions to demonstrate that Job really doesn't know much about nature at all. In Job's response in the final chapter, he says, I know that you can do everything, and that no thought can be withheld from you. I uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Similarly, Jesus told the Sadducees that they had too small a picture of God. He said, Ye do err, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. We also often have much too small a picture of how great God is. When I was a kid in Pathfinders, I did progressive classwork. One year, we were supposed to memorize the 10 Commandments. I'm not very good at memorizing and thought that was an awful lot of verses to memorize. I especially wondered why the second commandment was so long. It would have been a lot simpler if God had just made a short command, don't worship idols. I could have memorized it a lot easier instead of 2 rather long commands. Since then, I have realized that the second commandment is saying something different from the first. The first one says, Thou shalt have no other gods before me. But the second one says, even if you worship the true God, don't worship some human representation of how great that God is. It's easy to have too small a picture of what God is like. In Deuteronomy, God specifically said, You haven't seen what I look like, so don't try to make a representation of what I'm like. The danger is, once you start looking at that representation, you think that that is all there is to God, and you forget how great he is. Today, we may not have the problem so much of worshiping idols of wood and stone, but we probably still have the problem of having too small a picture of how great God is. When I was a kid, my older brother gave me the book, Your God is Too Small. The first half of the book has a number of chapters with example of how our picture of God is too small. One particular one caught my attention, entitled The Grand Old Man. God has been around a very long time, and Jesus taught fishermen and farmers, so he must not be very up to date. Would he be able to run a computer, or a nuclear facility, or fly a jet aircraft? Your first thought is, you just can't picture that. But of course, he would understand how to do that, and so much more. Now let's look at God's power in a different area. Elijah saw the power of God in nature on Mount Carmel, fire from heaven that consumed the sacrifice and the altar stones and the water. But then he fled from Jezebel to Mount Horeb. There he also saw what seemed to be God's power in nature, in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. But you notice that 1 Kings 19 says that God was not in any of those. Where was God instead? Apparently in the still small voice. This suggests to me that yes, we see God's power in nature, but there may be even a more important place where we see God's power, in that still small voice. So what is that power in the still small voice? I would suggest that it's a power that can turn the world upside down. In Romans 1, it says it's the gospel of Christ, the power of God to salvation. In 1 Timothy, it says, in the last days, men will have a form of godliness, but deny the power. From such turn away. So, there can be a power that turns the world upside down, but there can also be a form of godliness that lacks that power. In Colossians and in John chapter 1, we find that that power was fully manifested in Jesus Christ. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And where does God's power fit in? As many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. So this is the real power, to become sons and daughters of God. How do we share that message? That has been my question for many years as I work in the scientific community. How do I share that message with my science colleagues? Again, back to the desire of ages that I find so helpful. Though rich, learned, and honored, Nicodemus had been strangely attracted by the humble Nazarene. In another place, it says, men of the highest education in the arts and sciences have learned precious lessons from Christians in humble life, who were designated by the world as unlearned. And elsewhere, unprejudiced thinkers received his teaching and found that it tested their wisdom. The most highly educated were charmed with his words. I give another lecture about how we share our message. This slide is somewhat of an outline. Again, many insights from the desire of ages. She seems to suggest that it's not as much facts as a life to be shared. Several places she talks about sharing quietly and gently. At times, Jesus encouraged people not to speak at all. One example is about Paul as he talked to the philosophers in Athens. He felt he had been unsuccessful there, so at Corinth, he decided to use a different method, Christ only instead of argument. In other places, she suggests restraining without obscuring truth and how to meet opposition. I have many examples in working with my science colleagues of how I go about sharing. Here is one example. Almost 15 years ago, I attended a geology conference in South Africa. When I flew into Cape Town, I had to wait with the geology group for transportation to the conference venue. While waiting, I saw a strange man in the airport. He had long braided hair, a necklace of small skulls, and a hat with horns. Then I noticed that he was coming toward our group. He was one of the geologists attending our conference. In the van, I visited with him a bit. At the conference, we went out to eat at restaurants together several times. I didn't really try to talk to him about Christianity, but it came up because I told him about the university where I teach. We talked a bit about creation, and I suggested that life coming from non-life seemed pretty hard to have happen. He said, well, we just haven't figured that out yet. I didn't argue. We parted as friends. A couple years later, I attended some geology meetings in Portland, Oregon. As I was walking down a hall to a different session of talks, I saw him coming down the hall from the other direction. Over all of the other geologists, he called out to me, "You're that Christian, aren't you?" I smiled and said yes, and went on to my meeting. The next morning, I saw him and his wife eating at a local restaurant and went over to say hello. He said, you're a Mormon, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist." Then he asked what we believed. I've been asked this question many times as I worked at science labs. Often, I would just give a list of doctrines, but this time I decided to give a different answer. I said that I work at Loma Linda University, where we have the goal of continuing the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ in trying to make the world a better place. He liked that. I was on a week field trip with him again a couple years later. The first night, he again asked me about being a Christian. We had some additional friendly visits. I didn't convert him to Adventism. That isn't even my place to do. But we are friends, and he has a positive impression about what a Christian can be like. Not obnoxious, but someone he would like to spend time with. So, what do I have to share? I share my life story, the story of a believer, not because of signs and wonders, but because of God's picture of how to live. I grew up as a preacher's kid, studying both science and the Bible. The first article I wrote in academy was on evolution and creation. During college, I spent a year in Africa teaching as a student missionary. My geology master's degree at Loma Linda helped me realize how little we know. So I switched to physics at University of Colorado that seemed to provide much more certainty. In my dissertation acknowledgments, I thank God for the fascinating world he created to study. Now I am studying geology again, looking for coherence between God's two books. I find it useful to get out there and mingle with the people in the scientific community, to win people more than arguments, and to offer a Christ-like God, something more than pure naturalism, a caring God and community, and a better picture of what God is like, a God who is both totally good and fully powerful. Our God is a good God, even though we may see evil around us. I give a talk about dealing with the evil. Although we can't explain it, we find clues about evil within the context of creation and origins. God made a good creation, so evil is not God's fault. Humanity fell because God allowed free will and the opportunity to truly love. God sent a flood, showing how he responds to evil with justice and mercy. God became incarnate, so the Creator feels the evil along with us. God limits it in time, so evil is only for a moment. And God promises a future recreation where evil will be forever eradicated. And our God is a powerful God, for with God all things are possible. Our limited human understanding may result in seeming paradoxes, for God can be omniscient while we still have free will. For Jesus is both fully divine and fully human. God has 1,000 ways to do things of which we know nothing. So, we don't know how God accomplished everything in Genesis 1-11. 10 years ago, I organized some science and religion meetings in the Canadian Rockies. There were a lot of science talks and some philosophy talks. Afterwards, one of the attendees sent me an email where she said, "I didn't really understand all the details of the science, but I'm a believer, and here's a video clip that has meant a lot to me in understanding the greatness of God here in this world, and it leads me to see God in nature and to believe in him." Doing a Google search for YouTube creation calls gives many versions of this beautiful 5 to 10 minute video clip. Try it and see. You'll enjoy it a lot. For a benediction, I would like to give you this charge. As we see God's power in nature, may it remind us of the power of God we can experience in our own lives to become his children. Not power to argue for a particular viewpoint, whether in science or theology, but power to care about those who touch our lives. Not a form of godliness, but the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Very well.
So I'm sorry that we ended up with the wrong video for the first 15 minutes. But we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have some questions, I'll see what I can do to answer them. First of all, I'd like to make a point that if you're interested in this, seeing the video again, you can go to the Geoscience Research Institute booth, and there should be links there to all of the different presentations given by people at the Geoscience Research Institute. Also, I would encourage you to do a Google search or a search on YouTube for the title Creation Calls. There's several different versions of the video that I find to be quite beautiful, both the scenery around the world as well as the music that goes along with it. So if you have some questions, let me know. I'll make a few comments here, but if some questions come up on the screen, I will see what I can do to answer them. So we're doing research in the area of radiometric dating, plate tectonics, the igneous provinces, granitic and volcanic rocks. And I can give you lots of different discussions about creation arguments for long ages, short ages, and so forth. However, I found that often doing the arguments is not nearly as useful as presenting a life of a person who is a believer in the Bible, but also somebody who believes that the creation is God's handiwork and worthy of our study. So as I work in the science community, my biggest interest is showing my colleagues that we're able to work together with them in studying God's creation. In fact, one of my geology colleagues has specifically said that it's very useful to study God's two books, both the inspired record in the Bible, as well as his created works that we see in nature. I see that I have some questions here, so maybe I will try to answer a couple. I think we have about 5 minutes left. So one question is, where do you visit here in Peru? It looks like it's somebody from Peru. So the main place that we have worked is in the Pisco area, in the foothills of the Andes, east of Pisco and Ica. But we've extended our work both east to the Altiplano and Amazon, as well as north and south, to look at the what they call the Peruvian coastal batholith, the granitic rocks in the foothills of the Andes that go from north of Lima all the way south to Arequipa. So we've looked at a large area there, published in the scientific literature, and we're trying to understand the effects of plate tectonics on the granitic rocks there and on the uplift of the Andes. Let's see. It says, I recently read an article which proposed the view that quantum physics and general relativity preclude free will in humans. What is your opinion on this? Actually, from classical mechanics, there was the suggestion that everything is predetermined. If we know the exact position and velocity of every particle in the universe today, we can completely predict the future. But when quantum mechanics comes along, it actually suggests, well, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle suggests that you can't know everything exactly. And if you can't know everything exactly today, then you can't totally predict the future either. So there's the suggestion that quantum mechanics maybe allows the possibility of free will. So there's a lot of philosophy behind that could be discussed, but maybe I'll go on to a couple other questions here. What progress has been made on radiometric dating? As I have worked on radiometric dating, I work at a very prominent laboratory where they do radiometric dating, and I have found the methods to be excellent methods, and in working with the people there, they have been very good to work with. And so we use the standard radiometric dating methods in our work in Peru, as well as other places. How does one understand that in a short time frame? I do not have a good answer for that. I do know that in our studies, we have found that there are a number of things that can affect the isotope ratios. And this is well known in the scientific community. So we're looking at various options for understanding the isotope ratios in different scenarios. Let's see, what other questions do I have here? Has anyone ever found artifacts demonstrating the huge relative size of Adam and Eve? That is a question that we do get asked quite often, and I think the answer to that is no. We do not find examples of huge humans that are twice the size of modern humans. And there have been a lot of people looking for them, and there are pictures going around on the internet of people excavating very large skeletons, but I think that probably those pictures have been photoshopped together. I don't think that they're valid pictures. Here's another one about the environment. I'm no specialist in the environment, but it says, is the Earth's ozone layer sustainable for our survival in the long term? I would say that in general, it's important that we take good care of our environment. God created the Earth, and he tasked us with being stewards of it. And it's our responsibility to take good care of the Earth. So specifically about the ozone, I probably shouldn't say too much about that. That's not my specialty, but I would emphasize the need to take good care of the Earth because it's God's creation and we need to take care of it. I think I am about out of time here. And I think I have addressed most of the questions. If you have other questions, you are welcome to go to the Geoscience Research Institute booth. There's also a geoscience website that you can access from the GRI booth. And others or I will be in the booth different times over the next couple of days, and you can correspond with us. So thank you very much. And I hope that this encourages you to look at God's creation and see his handiwork there.
still, my soul. Be still, my soul. Be still. Be still.
Natural is good, isn't it? We are encouraged to eat natural food, to live a more natural lifestyle, and as much as possible to use natural remedies for our health issues. It makes sense because the word natural comes from nature, and nature is good. Or is it? There is a concept in biology that includes the adjective natural, and that some people consider a good thing. But I disagree. I'm talking about natural selection. Charles Darwin is known for being the father of the theory of evolution. The full title of his most famous book is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favorite Races in the Struggle for Life. In it, Charles Darwin attributes to natural selection the ability to create all the biological diversity that we know, the entire array of animals and plants from one or a few very simple organisms. In the last paragraph of the book, Darwin says that there is greatness in this conception of life.
Thank you for that correction. We will make that right now. Thank you.
See you tomorrow. Greetings from the Geoscience Research Institute. In today's presentation, we will reflect about our planet, considering data acquired from scientific investigation and interfacing it with the biblical perspective. So, is the Earth special? That's the question in the title of this presentation. The opinions on this differ. For example, in their book, The Privileged Planet, Gonzalez and Richards build a case for our planet not only being exquisitely fit to support life, but also fit to give us the best view of the universe, as if Earth were designed both for life and scientific discovery. Now, in another influential book, Ward and Brownlee refrain from using the concept of design and adopt a naturalistic model of Earth history. However, they also come to the conclusion that the Earth is probably to be considered special or rare, as the title of their book suggests, because they suggest that complex life is less pervasive in the universe than is commonly assumed. Finally, we can also consider a different point of view. In his book on planetary climates, Andrew Ingersoll concludes the book with a statement that presents yet another view which minimizes Earth's uniqueness. Earth seems to be a typical planet orbiting a typical star with a typical collection of raw materials that constitute the building blocks of life. There is no reason to believe we are alone. So in a certain sense, we see that there is this spread of understandings and postures when it comes to the Earth as a planet that can host life. Is this something unique and special or not? Well, from a scientific perspective, a new way to more directly investigate the question of how special the Earth is has opened in the relatively recent past with the discovery of exoplanets. Exoplanets are planets outside the solar system. And although their existence had been postulated earlier, their detection only occurred starting from the 1990s. And there are several ways of detecting exoplanets, but two are the most common. With this animation, we can begin to look at the first one, which is known as the radial velocity method. Now, this detection method is based on the fact that if a planet orbiting a star is quite massive, the center of mass of the rotational system will be a little off the star, meaning that the star too will be wobbling around the center of mass. So as we observe this rotating system from the Earth in a radial direction, the electromagnetic waves coming from the star will be compressed or dilated as the star moves closer and farther, respectively, in its wobbly motion. So this shift in wavelength illustrated at the bottom of the animation will be periodical, and from it, one can estimate a minimum mass for the orbiting planet and also its distance from the star. Now, the second method, which we will see in this other animation, is the transit method. And this has been the most fruitful in the detection of exoplanets so far. And this is based on the fact that a planet transiting in front of a star will block some of the light that is received from an observer more or less aligned along the orbital plane. So that dip in luminosity, that drop that we see in the animation, will be greater if the planet's radius is larger because it will block more light. Also, the dip in luminosity will be observed periodically as the planet keeps revolving around the star, allowing to calculate the duration of a full revolution and the distance of the planet from the star. Now, one implication for both these detection methods, as we will see from the next slides, is that they are biased towards finding larger planets orbiting close to the star. But with the application of these and other methods of detection, we can see how the number of confirmed exoplanets has increased over time. Here we have several plots in a time series, and on the plot we have the duration of the orbital period or duration of the year in Earth days on the x-axis, and the mass of the planet in Earth masses on the y-axis. So notice that the scale is logarithmic in both axes. We can see that in the early years Detections were based mostly on the radial velocity method and included only very massive planets. But then, as we move through the years, we see that especially with data from the transit method, the catalog expanded to include planets with masses less than 10% of the Earth's mass. And with our most recent count in 2021, in excess of 4,300 confirmed exoplanets. Now, the plot does not show yet a real overlap with our planet Earth in terms of orbital period and mass. You can see that the confirmed exoplanets with similar or smaller mass are closer to their star, and the planets with similar or greater orbital period are more massive than the Earth. However, it is expected that with improvements in detection methods, this field will continue to be populated. Now, the discovery of exoplanets has allowed us to ask questions, many new questions, like, for example, what kind of stars have planets? How many stars do actually have planets? And how common are Earth-sized planets? Or is there a relationship between planet type and size and the distance from the star? Or what fractions of exoplanets are in the habitable zone? All these questions are being investigated, but one thing is already clear. The number and diversity of exoplanets is much larger than number and diversity of planets that we have so far known in our solar system. And as the catalog grew, it included also some unexpected surprises. For example, the occurrence of gas giants similar to our Jupiter, but orbiting very close to their star. Most importantly, the exoplanet census illustrates that the possible set of planetary types and conditions is vast, so that Earth-like conditions are not a default in the universe. Let's then review together some of the parameters that astrobiologists, who are the scientists who study the conditions necessary to sustain life in the cosmos, let's review the parameters that they are considering as important for a planet to be a good place for complex organisms like us to live on. Here is an example of a definition. You can see that in this definition, there are some key elements in the definition of habitability for a planet. First, we see the term mostly rock. So therefore, the planet should be a terrestrial planet, not a gaseous one. Also, a planet that can retain an atmosphere with certain specifications. Also, a planet that has availability of energy sources with certain specifications. And then a planet where liquid water is present. And finally, a planet that can keep these sets of parameters stable over time. Now, this is just one definition of habitability, but no matter the specifications chosen to define habitability, it is clear that habitability is not a function of one single variable, but lies at the intersection of multiple factors that have to coexist. So it's a much smaller subset of all the possible physical chemical conditions present in the cosmos. So let's then review more in detail some of the commonly recognized parameters from planetary habitability. Now, although there are possible sources of energy that could be used to sustain life originating from the interior of a planet, the most important source of energy is light from the star around which a planet is orbiting. It is not only crucial as a source of energy for living organisms, for example, on the Earth through the process of photosynthesis, but most crucially, it controls the possibility of having the right temperature for the availability of liquid water on the surface of the planet. Now, the temperature on the surface of a planet is a function of the distance of the planet from the star, among other parameters. So too close, and it will be too hot for liquid water to be a stable phase. Now, too far from the star, and we will reach the frost line where water will turn into ice as the temperatures go below the freezing point. So this band or distance interval is called the Goldilocks zone or the habitable zone. And obviously, as you can see from the upper part of this illustration, the Earth is located within the habitable zone. Otherwise, we wouldn't have liquid water on its surface, right? Now, for a less massive star, like the one represented in the lower part of the figure, the habitable zone will be shifted closer to the star because of the smaller energy flux radiating from the star. Now, it turns out that not all stars are created equal. In our galaxy, stars less massive than the sun, like M stars at the top of this illustration, these stars are more abundant than sun-like G stars, which are represented at the bottom of the figure. So being less luminous, their habitable zone is located closer to the star. However, the M stars are also characterized by very high levels of emission of X-ray and ultraviolet radiation, actually up to hundreds times more intense radiation than what the Earth receives from the sun. Now, these energy flares and bombardment of high energy particles would affect the planets in the closely located habitable zone, making it difficult to preserve an atmosphere and also creating devastating effects for life. Moreover, at such close orbital range, a phenomenon which we will discuss later, which is called tidal locking, is also very likely to take place. And this would also decrease overall habitability. Therefore, even if there may be many planets in the habitable zone of a star, the kind of star and the type of radiation emitted are important parameters to consider for habitability. But why bothering so much about liquid water and even calling habitable the zone where temperatures are appropriate for the existence of liquid water on the surface of a planet? Well, we are all familiar with the fact that water is an important constituent of our bodies. What perhaps most of us do not realize is how intrinsic liquid water is to the life and metabolism of any living organism on Earth. As pointed out by Chaplin in an excellent review paper, liquid water is not a beat player in the theater of life. It's the headline act. Liquid water is essential for the folding, the structure, the stability, and the activity of proteins. It also plays a part in proton and in electron transfer reactions. And it plays a part in the structuring of DNA and in the recognition of specific DNA sequences by proteins. And it's also essential for the metabolic activity in the cell. So in other words, liquid water is essential for the biochemistry of life. No liquid water, no life. Let's now consider another important parameter for habitability, the atmosphere. Well, the atmosphere of a planet is important for life, not only for respiration, but also for temperature regulation by trapping some of the heat radiated from the planet. And it also controls climate. It provides a shield against some of the damaging solar radiation. And also it interacts with the hydrosphere and the lithosphere for the cycling of elements important for life. Now, when a planet is too small, its mass is too little to gravitationally maintain a stable, thick atmosphere. For example, in this image, we can see the thin, most likely ephemeral atmosphere of Pluto. However, even if a planet is massive enough to retain a thicker atmosphere, a thick atmosphere can also have negative consequences. Take, for example, Venus. Its thick atmosphere is rich in CO2, a greenhouse gas. What does that mean? Greenhouse means that that gas is able to trap the heat irradiated from the planet. And so that leads to higher temperature. So if you raise the temperature, you increase the saturated vapor pressure of water, which is also a greenhouse gas. So what this will do will be to trigger a runaway greenhouse effect. And that is thought to have led to surface temperatures on Venus of over 450 degrees Celsius and complete loss of water from the surface of the planet. Now, why is it that on Earth we don't observe this runaway effect? Well, on Earth, CO2 is dissolved in the oceans and is also trapped in limestone rocks, preventing this runaway process. And so this is yet another example of a balanced interrelation between different components of a planet. In fact, do you know, it's thought that even the interior of the Earth could be linked to the preservation of its atmosphere. The core is where the Earth's magnetic field is generated, and that field helps deflect some of the particles that could erode some of our atmosphere. Well, as we have seen in the definition of a habitable planet, one important requirement for habitability is for the planet to be a terrestrial planet, to have a solid, rocky crust. And this is not just because it would be hard for us to walk suspended in the atmosphere of a gas giant like Jupiter. It's more important because of the availability of heavy elements on the planet's surface. These heavier elements, heavier than the lighter element like helium and hydrogen, these heavier elements are necessary for life. And note how in the solar system, the terrestrial planets, which are highlighted by the rectangle, are also located in or near the habitable zone, closer to the sun. Now, the study of exoplanets has shown that this is not a given. It's not that terrestrial planets always have to be the ones that are in that particular location. Since there are other situations where instead of finding terrestrial planets closer to the star, we have gas giants at short distance from the star. Now, one should also note that the sun does not produce the heavy elements found in the Earth's crust. Standard models of planetary formation suggest that terrestrial planets form from the accretion of material out of a protoplanetary disk. So if this is indeed the way in which terrestrial planets form, it means that the protoplanetary disk must have the right initial composition to include the heavy elements. Therefore, not all stars will be orbited by terrestrial planets of the right composition. Furthermore, some have suggested that being a terrestrial planet may not be enough. It could be that the presence of active plate tectonics, as we observe on Earth, could be an additional requirement for habitability. Plate tectonics could be important for the maintenance of a magnetic field through interaction at the mantle and core boundary. It could also be important for cycling of the elements and the availability on the surface of chemicals important for life. And finally, through the process of crustal differentiation, plate tectonics could be responsible for the unique bimodal elevation profile of the Earth's crust. As you see in the diagram on the right, the Earth's crust has more buoyant continents with an average land elevation of about 800 meters, and depressed oceanic basins with average depth of about 3.6 kilometers below sea level. So this difference is what allows for the existence of land masses above sea level. If we didn't have this crustal differentiation, then we would have probably a much more relatively flat surface, and therefore oceanic waters would cover the whole surface of the Earth without the possibility of having a dry landmass. One more element to consider for planetary habitability is the stability of orbital parameters. With this term, we mean things like the eccentricity of the orbit, the inclination of the axis of rotation of the planet, and the relationship between the speed of rotation and the speed of revolution, which are connected to familiar rhythms like the year, seasons, and the day. Now, it turns out that when compared with other exoplanets, the Earth and the planets of the solar system have unusually low orbital eccentricity. Their orbits are nearly circular. This implies more stability and less risk of disrupting gravitational interactions, but also this implies stable rates of solar radiation over the year. Imagine if the orbit of the Earth was more eccentric, more squeezed. What would that mean? It would mean that periodically we would get in and out, possibly even of the habitable zone. Now, in a recent paper, Bachmuller and Jorgensen conclude that low eccentricities are typical, are not an exception. They are typical of systems with multiple planets. So what makes our solar system special is the fact that it has 8 planets. And so, because of that, the orbits have low eccentricity. Their estimate is that only 1% of exoplanetary systems have 8 or more planets. Now, the axial tilt of the Earth is also another important factor that controls the seasonal cycle. The inclination of the axis of the Earth is about 23.5 degrees, and it allows a good distribution of insulation over the year cycle, even at high latitudes. Now, if we had lower or higher tilt, well, this could result in thermal extremes across latitudes or thermal extremes over the year. Moreover, the large mass of the Earth's satellite, the Moon, stabilizes the axial tilt over time. Without Moon, it is thought that the Earth's tilt could swing more widely, and that would carry dramatic consequences for its ability to retain an atmosphere. Finally, another orbital parameter that we often take for granted is the fact that on the Earth, we experience the day and night cycle. Why is that? Well, this is because the period for a full rotation of the Earth, the day, is much shorter than the period for a full revolution, the year. However, it is possible for orbiting objects to slow down their rotation and attain a condition known as tidal locking, where their rotation and revolution periods are synchronous. And this is better illustrated by considering the Earth's and Moon rotational system, like we can see in this little animation. Now, have you ever paid attention to the fact that we always see the same face of the Moon? It is not because the Moon does not rotate, but it is because the Moon rotates around its axis in about 29.5 days, which is the same time that it takes for the Moon to revolve around the Earth. Therefore, the Moon is in synchronous tidal locking with the Earth. Now, imagine a planet in tidal locking with its star. One hemisphere would always be exposed to the light of the star, and that would lead to reaching very high temperatures. And the other hemisphere would always be in darkness at freezing temperatures, with clear negative implications for habitability. So how important is this tidal locking phenomenon? Is it unlikely that exoplanets will be attaining this condition, or does it seem likely? Well, on a paper on tidal locking of habitable exoplanets, Barnes concludes, tidal locking is possible for most planets in the habitable zones of GKM dwarf stars. The process of tidal locking is a major factor in the evolution of most of the potentially habitable exoplanets to be discovered in the near future. So this is indeed a very important parameter. Now, starting from this overview of planetary habitability, let's now shift to the biblical perspective and what we've encountered in the creation account in Genesis 1. The earth is presented with an initial state of being without organization and without life. Tohu, without form, vabohu, and void. And then what follows is God's action through the 6 days. And this action proceeds by organizing the spaces and filling them with life. What we have, therefore, is an extremely modern understanding of the connection between planetary organization and conditions as essential for life. In the 6 days creation, the forming is presented as an essential prerequisite, actually as integral to the filling of the earth. Now, the Genesis account is also very modern in presenting the essential parameters that God uses to organize the planet for life. We begin with light, the energy source. Liquid water is on the surface of the planet, and then we have the separation of the waters above, implying a connection between the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. Then we have the appearance of dry land, which signifies the rocky nature of this planet, but also potentially a process of crustal differentiation. And then finally, on day 4, the establishment of stable cycles, years, seasons, and days, which are all related to orbital parameters. Now, although the biblical perspective and scientific insight integrate very well when it comes to planetary habitability, we also need to acknowledge an important area of tension, the question of process. First of all, scientific models of planetary formation and Earth's planetary evolution are based on a long chronology of millions to even billions of years. Secondly, these mechanistic models rely on a naturalistic approach that denies any divine intervention. Let me just interject at this point that even if we had a perfectly naturalistic model for creating a habitable planet, that does not ensure that there will be life on it. There is no naturalistic model that can presently account for the emergence of life from inanimate matter. So, in other words, planetary habitability is necessary, but is not sufficient for life. Now, this clarification aside, how do I deal with this tension between the standard models of planetary formation and evolution and the biblical account of origins? When it comes to the question of time, the passive gap theory, which basically suggests that the universe and the planet Earth without life on it are much older than creation week, this model could alleviate some tension. But the recent creation week still includes significant planetary organization that would generally be accommodated in standard models over a long time. So the tension remains. And what about facing the naturalistic nature of this model? Well, for me, when I face this naturalistic alternative or this naturalistic approach, the Word of God remains my anchor. I confess my ignorance about the actual process that God used for planetary organization, if through accelerated process or if by fiat or on a pre-existing earth, but I trust that He did it, and in a recent creation week. So what do we do then with the amazingly insightful and sophisticated mechanistic models of planetary accretion and evolution? Do we throw them out of the window? No, not at all. My attitude is to keep learning and exploring. There is much value in knowing and hypothesizing. The synthesis, when it is not there, will come one day. Moreover, the practice of science teaches you a certain humbleness and gives us a better acquaintance with nature and its facts that we would not otherwise gain. So we are back then to our original opening question. Is the earth special? Well, perhaps it is too early to tell. Recently, Kunimoto and Matthews have published probabilistic estimates suggesting that the probability for a G star like the Sun to have a rocky planet of a size similar to the Earth's and orbiting within the habitable zone is less than 18%, which would translate into about less than 6 billion possible exoplanets that meet these requirements within the Milky Way galaxy. However, as we have seen, there is much more to habitability than just radius, distance from the star, and type of star. In any case, maybe there are many Earths, or maybe there is just one. But what counts is that we live in a universe where the Earth, our Earth, is habitable and there is life on it. That is the most amazing fact, confirmed by science. You and I are that miracle. Scientific insight helps us appreciate the complexity of life and how, among a myriad of possible combinations of different parameters, the Earth is a marvelously suitable space for us to live our lives. The Bible cuts through the noise and reveals in straightforward terms why this is so. It is so because God wanted it and did it. The Lord created the heavens. He fashioned and made the earth. He founded it. He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. In considering the miracle of our existence today on planet Earth, you and I face a choice. God has made a claim of ownership. We can reject it or embrace it. My invitation, embrace it. Embrace it because it's the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this presentation on the main stage. I may ask the host if to give me the ability to share the video, please. In the meantime, I would like to encourage every one of the attendees to submit questions through the Q&A feature on the webinar, and we will try to address as many as we can. I also would like to point out that the Geoscience Research Institute has virtual booth at the Global Camp meeting, so that is also another great option to continue the conversation in case we are not able to chat fully here together. Here with me is also Dr. Tim Standish, also a scientist at Geoscience Research Institute, and he will be help me moderating the questions that may come in. Welcome, Dr. Standish.
Thanks so much, Ronnie. It's always a pleasure for us to work together. It almost seems unfair that our offices are just a couple of doors from each other.
Yes, well, I would say we can begin our conversation. I have seen several comments being made in the Q&A section. Several of them are basically comments rather than questions.
So they all love you, which is great. It is wonderful to be able to speak with, among ourselves as a community of faith. It's just nice to be able to discuss these great questions that so many in the world really struggle with. But we as Adventists, we don't have to struggle with the basic question of, is the universe created? Is the world created? And so on. So I actually do have a few questions. And the first one is really a philosophical question that I think we can discuss. And that has to do with when we look out at the universe, or when we look at our Earth's position in it, it seems so very obvious that that we are dealing with a design situation. Somebody thought ahead and they anticipated the needs of human beings and created this home for us. How do we present this in a winsome way to those who do not share our belief, our worldview already, that everything is created? Because obviously this is not the standard view that a secular person or an atheist would embrace.
Well, I would say that there are the main trend that we are observing also with the study of exoplanet and with the discipline of astrobiology, which is basically the discipline that attempts to find life somewhere else in the cosmos rather than Earth. There is a great desire to really normalize, in a sense, life, trying to understand its what the elements and the parameters are, but also understanding that perhaps it's not something so special. So you notice that quote at the beginning of the presentation say that basically the Earth it's not that different in terms of the elements that make it up and its size and so on. So you can certainly stress the the nice combination of multiple parameters that make life possible, but you can also take them apart, and you can find many situations in the cosmos, because the universe is so vast, where you could find some similar combinations or those combinations. So when I am dialoguing with somebody who doesn't start from a design perspective, but rather from a perspective of chance. The universe is so vast, and there are so many combinations that in the end you will find something like the Earth, and we are bound to find life outside of the Earth. I always try to really stress the beauty, the power of what we have, what we are observing here on Earth. Really remark how this combination is not really trivial. This is something that we are observing to understand the possibility of life outside the Earth. We are really studying the many facets of life and its environments here on Earth. And the more we do this, I think the more it becomes clear that what we have here is amazing. It's a miracle. We have both the environment and the life in it, which is why I really think that the biblical account of Genesis 1 is modern, because it really gives you these two tracks, two elements: the emptiness in terms of no life, and the no form, tohu vabohu. So Genesis 1 says you need to really create a space that can sustain that life and then place life on it. And we have both here. When I consider this combination, I really believe that we bring to the attention a heightened awareness for how special what we have here on Earth is. And so that discussion, when somebody really begins to, instead of trivializing what we have, normalizing or taking it apart and saying, well, it's just, there are so many options and we're just one of them, I tend to stress the fact, well, look at us, look at what we have. It's you and I in this very moment are talking together, are breathing, are existing in a space that is real. And we didn't do this space. We didn't create this space. We didn't do anything. We have just inherited as a gift. That is what I think I would try to stress in a dialogue. I would concede that we have to be open to the vastness of the universe and the fact that such combinations can exist somewhere else, but at the same time, without losing or trivializing the beauty of what we have here.
To me, a simple way of understanding this is to imagine somebody trying to trivialize the Mona Lisa. I'll use a nice Italian example. And yeah, you know what? You can say that the Mona Lisa is just paint on, some surface, and it's just made out of atoms, and there are lots of other paintings out there in the world, but there is only one Mona Lisa. And there's something very, very special about that one painting. Obviously, the Earth itself is actually much, much, much more special than the Mona Lisa. But there's no that's just a special, unique thing. And the Earth, you see lots of headlines about finding other planets just like the Earth, and as soon as you start reading the details, they're nothing like Earth.
Yeah, my point is, I'm not really trying to deny the fact that there might be exoplanets that, in the future we might discover some that have many similarities with the Earth. That's not bad. It's just that we need to also be able to treasure what we are, what we have. And I like your connection with art. Usually it's not something that comes to mind for a geologist. It's when you look at rocks, it's really more about the chemistry and the mineralogy and so on. But thinking in terms of art also, well, I think that the more you study the Earth from a scientific point, the way it works, the systems that are present on our planet, an appreciation really starts to emerge. It's almost the appreciation of a student of art, because it is incredible. It's incredible, the combination, the amount of processes and the vastness of lines that we can research and explore. It's amazing.
It is. This is a great time in history to be a scientist and a believer. At least I certainly believe that. Of course, I'm not a geologist. I see it in biology. There are some questions that have come in. We'll start off with one from Murrieta. And first of all, she thanks you for a great presentation. So do I. I hope that everybody feels that way. But then the question, when Jesus comes, will the Earth be knocked off its axis?
Well, this question is hard for me to address, honestly, because the second coming of Jesus is a physical event, but it's also beyond my everyday experience. What Jesus will do when he comes back will be something that will be very, it's a singularity for me. When in 2 Peter chapter 3, when Peter tries to address the concept of uniformitarianism in Earth history, it says, there are people that say things just continue the same way as from the beginning of creation. He lists three discontinuities, or three times in Earth history that are basically a discontinuation of this way of thinking. There are singularities. The first is the beginning, the creation. The second is the flood. And then he says we must not forget that the Earth is reserved for this incredible change that will occur or take place when Jesus comes back. So I really do not have the instruments to address this type of question. We can look back in a sense, but you see, even in my presentation, I have difficulties. I explained some of the tension that I experienced. Part of me is intrigued by understanding what are the mechanistic processes of the models that brought the planet to its shape. I believe God did it, but I want to know how. And so in that respect, I encounter some limitations. Naturalistic models don't have that problem. Naturalistic models just try to extrapolate as much as possible in the past without any divine intervention. But if we insert God's action in the picture, and that's what Peter is telling us exactly, saying, don't forget that the beginning too is a singularity, then there are some limitations to what we can infer or how far we can go back. So some may see this as a loss. I don't see it as a loss. I see that, first of all, we have the present Earth, and God has given it to us in the cosmos for us to explore what we have at the moment. So we expand our knowledge of science in the present, and we go as far as we can go back and in the future. And secondly, it's not a loss because in the process of learning and in the process of exploring, God develops our humility and our wisdom. And we never have to give up understanding and interfacing and dialoguing with every model and every theory that is presented, starting from our biblical foundation.
Yes, it's when I read this question, I wondered, and I certainly don't want to put words into Marietta's mouth. So she may have been thinking about something a little bit different, but there is a theory out there that says that at some point in history, perhaps during the flood or the event that precipitated the flood, was a change in the Earth's axis. And one of the things that I've been impressed by is the fact that the current axis of the Earth is actually a very good axis. What it does is it maximizes the inhabitable surface of the Earth. So I'm not entirely sure that that's a great theory. None of these are really biblical. You know, we're sort of inferring things based on what we know about science and what we believe the Bible to be saying. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a heady mix. Sometimes it's okay to just understand we don't know because we don't have sufficient information right now.
Yeah, the concept of season is presented already in the creation week on day 4. So we understand that obviously seasonality is related to the tilt of the Earth's axis. So I don't think there's nothing bad actually with the axial tilt. There are 2 planets in the solar system that have don't have that type of tilt. Venus has almost a vertical tilt, and Uranus actually has pretty much like a horizontal tilt. So what happens with these 2 configurations? Both are not ideal. In one, we have basically a seasonless. Well, first of all, you have at the high latitudes very little insulation and no seasonal cycle. And in the case of Uranus or an exoplanet that has basically a horizontal axis of rotation, you would have one hemisphere that receives light for a long period of the year and the other hemisphere basically in darkness. So both of those have serious consequences for life and habitability. You could mitigate some of these effects, for example, with having an atmosphere that can transfer some of the heat from one hemisphere to the other ones and so on. But, you know, the scenarios become more and more complex.
Yes, and even then, the tilt of the Earth does help to drive the ocean currents and so on, which is one of the ways in which we pump heat from tropical areas to those areas towards the poles. So it's pretty good. But anyway, one last question because we're almost out of time. Is Earth's ozone layer sustainable for human survival in the long term?
Well, what I would really think here It's the aspect that even the composition of the atmosphere is important in a sense. Why, for example, the ozone layer acts as a shield, basically, from some damaging radiation. So that is very important, that we have an atmosphere with a certain composition. Oxygen and nitrogen, for example, are relatively transparent gases, so that they don't really, they're not greenhouse gases. They don't trap infrared radiation like other gases like CO2 or water itself. For example, water vapor is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So we see that the composition of the atmosphere itself is an important factor for habitability. Now, if the question is more related to the sustainability in time, like, are we going to damage this protective shield in time? That opens up a very interesting line of discussions. Can humans, in some ways, affect the habitability of the planet itself?
You have 5 minutes.
It's an incredible thought to think that we may be the ones that are messing some aspect that make our own planet habitable, and we may have that influence of really affecting the habitability of the planet in negative terms. I believe it is true, and the Bible confirms that. In some ways, we are the destroyers of the earth, and the Lord certainly is trying to work against that, help us to really be stewards of our planet and protect the earth and protect our lives rather than bringing it to an end.
And certainly with the specific case of ozone, we have seen the human impact in terms of released halogenated hydrocarbons like Freon that have caused a decrease in ozone concentrations in polar regions, which is very real and makes life more difficult. The good thing is God allowed us to find these things out, but also provided us with the intelligence to deal with a situation like that by stopping producing and releasing those particularly damaging gases to our atmosphere. I believe that we need to wrap things up. I think prayer is the best way to end, and I wonder if you would close with prayer, Ronnie.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Lord, we are grateful that you made us and you gave us the earth. We are grateful that you gave us a house, a planet, and that this planet is habitable. We also understand, Lord, that we live not in the original creation, and that we experience many tragedies in this world. And it is for this reason that we look forward to the restoration and your second coming. Help us to be good stewards and good Christians that share your love with others as we wait for you to come. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Well, we invite you to stay to hear our colleague, Noemi Duran. She is up next, and wish you all God's blessing as we celebrate the creation that God made for us.
Thank you. And don't forget to visit the GRI website here on, you can see it, grisda.org, or the virtual booth at the Global Camp meeting in the James White Pavilion.
Yes, and if we didn't get to your questions, that is a great place to take them, the booth, and ask us in the chat feature that we have there. God bless you, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
still my soul, be still my soul. Your God will undertake to guide the future as He has the past. Your home, your confidence let nothing shake. All love is there shall be bright at last, be still my soul.
Welcome you to our presentation on God's wrath in the book of Revelation. I'm glad that you've joined us for this, and a very important topic for us as Seventh-day Adventists, particularly because the three angels' messages is at the heart, the foundation of our mission and our message and our calling as a people. I invite you to join me for a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity, the privilege we have of studying your word, and please give us each wisdom and guidance as we explore this important topic. In Jesus' name, amen. So as we start here, I'd like to just open up with Revelation 14, verses 9 through 11, the third angel's message, where it says, "Then another angel, a third, followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb." So not a very welcoming picture at all, a very solemn warning, and clearly with the gravity of the warning in these two verses, it behooves each one of us to study diligently what is the beast, what's the mark of the beast, how we can make sure we do not receive that. And that's not really our topic today. We're going to be focusing on this idea of the wrath of God and how it unplays in the book of Revelation. And we want to notice, first of all, that the wrath of God is a broad biblical topic. We're going to look at a few different passages. Let me read verse 11 here. "And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast in his image and whoever receives the mark of his name." So this ongoing imagery. And it's important for us as we start to delve into Revelation's description of the wrath of God that we understand a couple of key ideas about Revelation itself. I often tell my students that Revelation doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. In other words, Revelation is full of imagery. In Revelation chapter 1, for example, there's a picture of a sword coming out of the mouth of Jesus. That does not mean that Jesus has a literal sword emanating from his mouth. Rather, it's a metaphor, it's a picture for an actual reality that Jesus will judge, and he will use his word to bring about that judgment. So again, Revelation doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. We need to take that into view. A second key point here for us is that it's important for us to continually read or become rereaders of Revelation so that we can be informed by the entire book rather than pulling out one passage and determining the meaning simply from that one passage. In the book of Revelation, there are two different words in the Greek, thymos and orge, that refer to God's wrath or God's anger. And these appear in numerous places throughout the book of Revelation, as we'll see momentarily. One of the things I want to highlight in our study is the way many commentators view the topic of the wrath of God in Revelation. So this is Stephen Smalley, who's written a commentary called The Revelation to John. And on page 366, he says this: "Those who consistently reject divine love will experience God's animosity untempered by mercy. Now, interesting expression, God's animosity. It's almost as if there's this visceral response in God to those who have rejected divine love. From Brian Blunt, again, his commentary in Revelation, page 275, the wine in God's cup is much more potent than anything Babylon or Rome may have concocted. So Blunt, in his commentary, focuses largely in the Roman context and sees Babylon and the beast, all of that in the setting of ancient Rome. But here, the key point again is that as torturous as the Roman Empire might have been, God's cup is much greater, much more painful than that. Again, a kind of a contrast, which is not a very pleasing picture of God. C.H. Dodd, a number of years ago, in his book, The Apostolic Preaching and Its Development, wrote this: "We are bound to judge that in its conception of the character of God and its attitude to men, the book," speaking of the book of Revelation, "falls below the level not only of the teaching of Jesus, but of the best parts of the Old Testament." So for Dodd, because of this issue with the wrath of God in Revelation and this portrayal of God's animosity, according to Stephen Smalley, the book of Revelation really is not just below the teachings of Jesus, but from other parts of the Old Testament. And J.P.M. Sweet asked the question, does Christ finally conquer in the manner of the beast? And this is a very fundamental question for us as we consider the wrath of God in Revelation. At the end, does Christ just take over the techniques, the procedures, and the posture of the dragon and the beast and use them for his own ends? Now, clearly, if we look back in the Old Testament, as I said, their wrath is a multifaceted topic in Scripture. So, for example, in Numbers 25, 1 through 16, we have the experience of the rebellion at Baal Peor, where the people began to worship with idols. They were fornicating with the Midianites, and this brought about a great sin to Israel and put them at grave danger. And then it tells us in Numbers 25:4 that there was actually a commanded execution from the Lord to Moses to turn away the anger of the Lord. So this is a very interesting picture in the book of Numbers. In Patriarchs and Prophets on page 455, Ellen White mentioned that all felt the punishment was just, and the people hastened to the tabernacle with tears and deep humiliation, confessed their sin. So this is one aspect of the wrath of God. Another aspect of God's wrath is found in John 3:36, where Jesus tells us that people are experiencing the wrath of God now. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him. So in some sense, according to John here in the Gospel of John, there's a present manifestation of this. Then in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, Paul describes the wrath of God as revealed against ungodliness, Romans 1:18, and following through Romans in verses 24, 26, and 28, all in Romans chapter 1, it describes God giving them over, God giving them up to their own passions, delivering them over. So we see different aspects of the wrath of God from a biblical perspective. Question for us, of course, is how is it being portrayed in the book of Revelation? We notice in Revelation that the two Greek words that are translated wrath or anger, again, thymos and orge, are used in numerous places. And here on the screen, you can see the verses in Revelation that apply these words to God's wrath. However, what's interesting here, as in each one of these instances, it's in the noun form, not in a verbal sense. There are only 3 places in Revelation where you find the verbal tense of the noun wrath or anger. In other words, to become angry or to be wrathful. Revelation 11:18, Revelation 12:12, and then 12:17. notice Revelation 11:18, speaking under the seventh plague, and the nations were angry. So there's wrath in the nations, but they become or they experience anger. And then when it speaks about God's wrath, it says, and your wrath came. So there's a slight difference, a slight but important difference in the way John speaks about the wrath of the nations and the wrath of God. The wrath of the nations is an experienced wrath. They become enraged, angry in the verbal sense. But in the other context, it's like God's wrath has arrived. The time for God's wrath to be manifested has come. Different setting. Then, of course, in Revelation 12:12 and 12:17, we find the two other verbal uses where it says, having great wrath, speaking about the dragon, and then also stating that the dragon was enraged. So here's another dynamic of that. The dragon was enraged. So on an emotional or verbal sense, in terms of experiencing wrath, it's the dragon and the nations that are in rebellion that experience wrath. The rest of the time in Revelation, where it talks about God's wrath, it's speaking of his wrath arriving or coming. Well, how do we make sense of this? I think we could say that orge or wrath is God's settled response and reaction to sin and the activity of Satan. It's not an emotional state that God experiences, but it's this reaction to or response to the activity of Satan. Here we have in Sigby Tonstad's commentary, new commentary on Revelation on page 207, where he says something similar. He says, the third angel's message emerges as the most pointed and explicit reaction to the devil's action. And when we look through Revelation clearly, we find from Revelation 12 and 13 and parts of 14 that the emphasis has shifted in Revelation. John begins to focus on the dragon's story. That's what we find in Revelation 12. And then in Revelation 13, the dragon goes and he gets his two associates, the sea beast and the land beast, from Revelation 13. And then in Revelation 13 as well, the dragon acts in a godlike manner in which he gives authority to the beast. And then there's a series of verses that underscore how Satan is acting in a godlike manner. And John indicates this through his passive use of the word to give in Revelation 13. So the idea here is you see the dragon becoming center stage in 12 and 13 and trailing off in chapter 14, but still it's the dragon's action that brings about the reaction from God. So let's think momentarily about the metaphors that John uses in Revelation just to describe God's wrath. And remember, as I said, Revelation doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. We have two preeminent metaphors that John uses, two word pictures. In Revelation 14, as we already noted, he uses this picture of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. So there's this concept of cup and wine. And then also in Revelation 15 and 16, the wrath of God is connected to the seven last plagues. So let's consider this and how can we understand these metaphors? And let's first think about the plagues. So if we notice the connection of the plagues to Babylon, we find in Revelation that the plagues are largely connected with Babylon's collapse. So in Revelation 14, in verse 8, we have the second angel's message, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. Now that fall is amplified and more fully completed in Revelation chapter 18, where Babylon comes to a complete destruction in Revelation chapter 18. In Revelation 16, under the seventh plague, Babylon again falls apart. The great city is divided into three parts. And Revelation 17 in verse 16 also describes the collapse of Babylon. So as we think of the 7 last plagues and the wrath of God, we need to begin to think through, how does this connect with Babylon's fall? And does the fall of Babylon help us understand anything about the wrath of God in Revelation? Well, there's a very interesting insight here in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 16. After the annunciation of the 7 plagues in chapter 16, John gets a fuller description of the fall of Babylon in chapter 17 and 18. But then there's this key verse, chapter 17, verse 16, where John writes, "And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot and eat her flesh and burn her up with fire." So in Revelation 17, it's the beast, which was supporting Babylon, and the 10 horns, which are the kings of the earth, they in fact turn against the beast and eat her flesh and burn her with fire, bring about her own destruction. In other words, we could say that Babylon goes through a self-destruction. And this self-destruction is connected with the plagues and the pouring out of God's wrath. Certainly, under the plagues, we see satanic activity clearly manifested. This is brought to view in the 6th plague, where out of the mouth of the dragon and the beast and the false prophet come the unclean spirits, which go out to deceive the world and gather them together for the great day of the battle of Armageddon. So that's an important point as well, that the plagues will also come back to us when we think about the wine and the cup. So Babylon as a system self-destructs. We see that through the satanic activity I just mentioned. We see that through Revelation chapter 17 in verse 16 as well. Now in Revelation 18, verses 6 through 9, we find this: "Pay her back even as she paid. Give her back double according to her deeds. In the cup which she has mix twice as much for her, and she will be burned up with fire. For the Lord God who judges her is strong." So now the question naturally arises, who is causing the fire here? In chapter 17, we found that it's the beast and the kings of the earth that devour her with fire. In this verse, it appears that God is doing it. What's John the Revelator trying to tell us? Well, again, we need to keep in mind that in the book of Revelation, God's wrath is a settled reaction to Satan's action. And we find this idea of paying back double drawing from the Old Testament, where there's double judgment. In Deuteronomy chapter 19, for example, in 18 through 19, we find that if a witness accuses somebody and tries to have a punishment given to them, and then it turns out that they are a false witness, what they have wanted to happen to someone else should come back twice on themselves. So that's the foundation of this idea of double judgment. We know that the beast and the dragon and Babylon have tried to have persecuted God's people, have been a persecuting power, and now the slander and the calumny that they have reproached God with comes back on Babylon double. We find the same thing in Esther, chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, where Haman is hung on his own gallows. And then so you see some of these other verses here, Jeremiah, and the texts in Ezekiel. The one that's a little different is Isaiah 40 and verse 2, in which Isaiah promises double grace, the way I understand the passage, double grace to the people who have been forgiven. So when we think about this concept of pouring out double, it's an imagery of getting what they deserve back. What they've tried to cause to others comes back on their own head. In Ezekiel 28, verses 17 to 18, we also have that interesting chapter that talks about the king of Tyre. And many of us would see that a reflection of the fall of Lucifer in Ezekiel chapter 28 under the imagery of the king of Tyre. He was a cherub. He was in the Garden of Eden. There's lots of allusions there that point to the fact that this is really talking about Satan before his fall. But in verses 17 and 18, again, there's this imagery of burning with fire, but Ezekiel says that the fire comes from within. So again, it's this idea of a self-destructive act, much like we see in chapter 17 of Revelation. In Revelation 18, verse 20, we have this passage, rejoice over her, O heavens, and you saints, and apostles and prophets, because God has judged your judgment. And then the end of that verse is my translation, where it says, out of her. The Greek preposition ek is used there, ekatu, out of her. So judgment coming out of her, which is what we see in Revelation chapter 17 as well. So if we think of God's wrath in relation to the plagues, there clearly is this aspect of underneath the plagues of the judgment coming from and in a sense being self-inflicted. We have this quotation from early writings, page 276, where it says, the cries of the oppressed have reached unto heaven, and angels stand amazed at the untold agonizing sufferings which man, formed in the image of his maker, causes his fellow man to experience. Sorry for missing that part. Then the justice of God will be satisfied. In other words, the sufferings that have been brought upon others come back on the head of Babylon. So the plagues reveal, the wrath of God as understood through the plagues, reveal that Babylon is given up to her own choices and her actions. Well, let's switch the metaphor and back to Revelation chapter 14, where there's the imagery of the cup of indignation, the wine or the wrath of God. And at the end of Revelation 14, there's a picture that John describes in verses 19 to 20 of the harvest of grapes, representing those who have allied themselves to Satan, that are thrown into the winepress of God. So here we have the wine, the cup, the winepress, that metaphor merging into itself. And then the fruit of that wine, or the blood, as it's brought out in Revelation 14, comes out of the winepress and reaches, I think it's 12,000 stadia, up to the horses' bridles, all outside the city. It's a very gory picture if you think of blood going up that high, that far outside the city. But again, Revelation doesn't mean what it says, it means what it means. So what's the imagery of here? Horses' bridles outside the city. How do we understand this? Well, there's a couple of points we want to pull together here. First of all, there is a satanic army of horses found under the trumpets. That's a very clear image that we find in Revelation chapter 9. A very clear demonic army portrayed as horses. But there's something else at play here. And the winepress imagery merges into that of a battle. But the war theme draws us back to the imagery of the plagues. Now, remember what I said under the sixth plague, that the dragon and his two associates, they go forth to the world, to the kings of the earth, to draw them together to the great battle of God Almighty, the battle of Armageddon. That battle in Revelation chapter 16 is a high point in the battle that has begun in chapter 12. But the final display of that battle is brought to view in chapter 19. And this is where we begin to see all these images, all these metaphors mixing together. So outside the city, if we walk backward from Revelation, we find the holy city comes down. Revelation 21 is the new Jerusalem. In Revelation 20, there's this picture of the city. And then outside the city is this tremendous battle. That battle is described in Revelation 19, 15 and following. And particularly in Revelation 19, it describes the army and the horses that the army and the horses the people are sitting on, picking up the imagery from chapter 9. But again, a very powerful satanic imagery. So when we think back to Revelation 14:20 and this wine press coming out and flowing the blood up to the horse's bridle, John is encapsulating the end of the book of Revelation here into chapter 14. And he's giving us hints as to understand how to understand this wrath of God picture. Again, in the plagues, Babylon self-destructs. And here we find something similar in chapter 19 and following. So as we think of the imagery in chapter 19 as Christ coming, we see Jesus as the divine warrior. He's got flaming eyes. He's got diadems, crowns for the first time in the book of Revelation. He has numerous titles, and then he has a robe dipped in blood. And the two Old Testament antecedents for that are from Isaiah 63 and from Genesis 49, where Joseph's garment rather, has been dipped in blood. Now, notice this. The question, of course, is when does Christ's garment become dipped in blood? James Rescue, is it before or after the battle? Well, notice what James Rescue in Revelation, page 238 says. Christ's garment is stained with blood before the battle because victory has already been won on the cross. And this is very essential for us. Earlier in Revelation, John has made clear to us how God engages in war. So the winepress imagery merges into the imagery of the battle, but Revelation has already made manifest how the battle is won. And this informs our understanding of the wrath of God. Revelation 5:6, one of the elders said to me, "Stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome to open the book and its 7 seals. And I saw before the throne with the 4 living creatures and the elders, a lamb standing as if slain." And sorry for the slight typo there. I saw between the throne, a lamb standing as if slain. So early in Revelation, we get a picture as to how the lamb overcomes, how they are victorious in the battle. Donald Guthrie explains in his book, The Lamb in Revelation, the article, The Lamb in Revelation, clearly what he's saying is what the Lamb does, God does. So it's important for us to take all of Revelation into account when we're trying to understand the images and metaphor. So rather than portraying the end time victory, the wrath of God coming through violence or coming through animosity, the slain lamb serves to demonstrate God's victory through suffering love. Laurent Johns explains, the conquering one conquers by being a slain lamb. Pardon me. In addition to this, God's people also follow this pattern. Revelation 12:11, it tells us that they've overcome him, the dragon, because of the blood of the lamb and the word of their testimony. That is, they do not love their life even when faced with death. In other words, God's people are willing to follow the same self-sacrifice. In Revelation 17:6, we see that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses. As God's people are conquered, they are actually conquering. And then when double comes back to Babylon, she is reaping the results of her actions. She is experiencing God's reaction to her action. Great Controversy 627 tells us, to our merciful God, the act of punishment is a strange act. The nation with which he bears long will finally drink the cup of wrath unmixed with mercy. Mercy currently holds back the winds of strife. Mercy currently holds back Babylon from receiving her just due. One day that mercy will be removed and the cup of double punishment, double reward will come to Babylon. Desire of Ages, page 58, Ellen White writes, in the day of final judgment, every lost soul will understand the nature of his own rejection of truth. The cross will be presented and its real bearing will be seen by every mind that has been blinded by transgression. Before the vision of Calvary with its mysterious victim, sinners will stand condemned. Men will see what their choice has been. Every question of truth and error in the long-standing controversy will then have been made plain. In the judgment of the universe, God will stand clear of the blame for or existence of, or blame for the existence or continuance of evil. Bible Echo, Ellen White says, the atonement of Christ has given opportunity to every soul to become a child of God. But those who continue in transgression become one with the originator of sin. They draw their nourishment from Satan. And so in the final act, where God's wrath is displayed, this settled reaction against God's act, Satan's action, those who have chosen to align themselves with Satan, the dragon, and the beast, they receive their ultimate choices as well. And finally, in Bible Echo, Ellen White says this, the sufferings of every man are the sufferings of God's child. And those who pass by perishing fellow beings without pity or help provoke God's grievous anger. It is the wrath of the Lamb. So the wrath of the Lamb here in this context, again, is a reaction to the indifference of humanity towards suffering humanity. It's my prayer that as we consider how we are living as Seventh-day Adventists, that we do not partake of this indifference, but rather that we are faithful to our fellow men. And you will please God. God loves the world. Love it too, and you will be accepted by him. Let's pray as we close. Father in heaven, thank you for a practical thought here that we can be one with you as we love the world the way you loved it, being willing to be self-denying, self-sacrificing, to give ourselves for others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, so now we're having some time for questions and answers. I want to let you know for you to please stay until the end because we're going to do a giveaway at the end. We're going to have a draw of an amazing prize, so stay tuned. And now, please write your questions so we can get going on with the questions and answers. If the host is there, would be good if he could let me to turn on our camera because we're not allowed to turn on our camera. So please, Mr. Host, if there's a host, maybe it's gone. Well, meanwhile, let's start with some questions. Question number 1. Why OCI is into seminars about Revelation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for whoever put it together. The OCI's whole focus is to serve and strengthen ministries that are working with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we realize that around the world are a variety of wrong concepts or ideas that are, let's say, outside the playing field of our belief structure. And so one of the things that OCI does to help its ministries is to be a resource for those ministries if they have spiritual questions, if they are confronted with a teaching that they are concerned might be aberrant. We have resources that we can use to help those ministries, kind of like just a place to check in, call somebody, see what resources there might be available. Certainly not putting ourselves on the level of the BRI or anything like that. But in terms of supporting ministries around the world, OCI has a great reputation for being theologically sound and helpful to its various ministries.
Awesome. Here we have another question that says, what were the Old Testament verses for Christ robe dipped in blood?
Sure. So that's a reference back to Revelation chapter 19 during the war scene where Christ has a robe dipped in blood. And there are a couple of Old Testament references to that. One was Isaiah 63. One was Genesis 49. And then the one that I didn't put on the screen, which I really should have, was from the book of Genesis, the experience with Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, where Joseph's robe is dipped in blood as well. So those are the 3 main pictures that John draws from in the book of Revelation.
Awesome. Before the next question, dear host, if you're there, please allow us to show our video, our camera. And the next question says, could you please relate the passage of Romans 1, 18 to 31 to tonight's topic?
Sure. So, I referenced Romans 1 earlier. And as I said in the very beginning, the concept of the wrath of God is a broad picture. And I would be cautious against forcing any book that we're looking at as the template, how we're going to understand everything else. They may give us insights and they may give us guidance. But in Romans chapter 1, Paul is very clear that the wrath of God is revealed by his giving up, by allowing people to receive the results of their choices. And that's the main thought there in Romans chapter 1, that God gives them up to the lusts of their flesh, gives them up to the pride of their life, things along those lines.
Awesome. At last, we could turn on the video, but our host needs to shut off his video now. But well, anyways, at least you can see us now. We have another question here.
Looks like we're very tiny though.
Yeah, we're very tiny right there. Maybe if I change the view to gallery there, yeah, maybe a little bit there. I don't know if I can pin this for everyone. No, I can't pin for everyone, but dear host, if you can take out the video track and leave us there. Awesome. Next one says, do you see God's wrath as his giving people up to their choices?
So clearly that's the aspect that's portrayed in Romans chapter 1. In the book of Numbers, where I also read from the very beginning, you have what appears to me to be a different kind of that. Certainly people are reaping the results of their choices, but it looks like in the book of Numbers and in a couple of other places in the Hebrew scriptures, there appears to be more of an activity where God actually tells people to act as agents of execution of judgment. And we know that holy angels have acted in that manner in the past. So yes, but I would say that doesn't seem to be the whole story. Of course, when we are looking at the book of Revelation, again, both the noun and the verbal aspects and the imagery there in Revelation draws us more to this view of God's wrath being a reaction to Satan's activity. Very different than what some of the scholars I quoted at the beginning of the presentation, where now this is God's animosity. It's almost as if God has lost his patience, and now this is what God's going to do. And if you think Rome was bad, just wait and see what God's going to do. Well, that to me is a complete caricature, because then you are painting God with the colors of the character of the dragon or of Satan. And the two are completely distinct and opposite throughout the entire scriptures, but especially in the book of Revelation.
Thank you very much. And thank you, dear host, for allowing us to show our video now. We have another question. Here it says, remember that there's going to be a giveaway at the end, so don't go.
Just hang with us for a few more minutes.
The question says, I see Revelation 29 not as wrath, but as love. Unless God intervenes, Satan and his followers will destroy God's obedient children. It's a very human reaction. I would definitely destroy anyone who comes into my home and harm my children. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so what was the chapter again?
Revelation 20, verse 9.
20. Yeah, so I was assuming talking about the fire coming down from heaven. Yes, certainly that's a reaction. Again, there are other passages in scriptures where God is a consuming fire, and the psalmist asks the question, who could abide in his presence? The one with clean hands and a pure heart. So there needs to be a spiritual condition to abide in God's presence. The question is, for our presentation tonight, is this kind of a emotion feeling that God has, that he is now wrathful against these individuals, or is it a settled reaction? And I would suggest, argue that it's much more of a settled reaction. The emphasis on the noun versus the verb in Revelation helps support that.
Thank you. We have another question. We have a lot of questions now. Now they came a lot in. So what is the implication to viewing God's wrath as giving them up? Romans 1 versus execution, fire, brimstone, Genesis?
Yeah, so again, the questioner is positing an either or, and like God's wrath is only one or the other. And if you're going to take that lens, then from my perspective, you'd have to do some pretty strong gymnastics, mental gymnastics in other parts of Scripture. I'm not really ready to do that myself. I think we need to let study each passage in its context. And I think, again, there are passages in Genesis or in Numbers, as we looked at, that seem to speak very clearly about God's wrath in a certain way. And then you have the Romans aspect as well. So my caution would be to make one matrix that's explaining everything rather than letting the individual biblical writers make their contribution to our understanding.
Okay, great. Here are two questions. I'm going to respond the first one. How can we reach OCI? Very easy. You can go to outpostcenters.org, or you can go to the exhibit hall, to the Joseph Bates Pavilion. And there we are. You can just schedule a time to talk with us or type there in the chat, see what we have. We are happy to help you. OCI is all about helping ministries thrive. So if you have a ministry and you need to get better, we are here to help you be a successful ministry. Okay, now with the question, with the topic is love a blending of mercy and justice? Then if the wrath in Revelation 14 is without mixture, meaning without mercy, so the action is without love? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
That's a very interesting question. So yeah, love is a blending of justice and mercy. Interesting. Love is righteousness. Righteousness is harmony with God's law. Love is harmony with God's law. Mount of Blessings brings that concept out. But when we think of the final end, and maybe this is this simplest way, at least I could try to explain it, is that when we think of the final end, both justice and mercy are completely satisfied. So it will be justice that metaphorically stands at the gates to the New Jerusalem and tells redeemed sinners, come on in. It'll be justice that welcomes them. And then it'll also be mercy that says to the unrepentant, no, you are not welcome in. Now, again, I'm just using a word picture here. So justice and mercy are blended together. Yes, there is a point where mercy no longer pleads, but what is that point and what happens at that time? I think we get a clearer picture, particularly if we look at the 7 last plagues, from the satanic imagery, that it's the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet using demonic activities to go to gather the whole world together for the great day of the battle of God Almighty, which is Armageddon. And so it's the satanic activity that is in the fore of the destructive acts in this part of the book of Revelation.
We're having really interesting questions. Really, really interesting. Check out this one. What is the wrath of God in Revelation? Will sin and evil be eradicated by means of self-destruction and kind of implode because of its own evilness? Or is the wrath of God something that God actively does in opposing sin at the end of time?
Yeah, very good question. I got a dear friend that just thinks, yeah, sin implodes people. And I guess I have hesitancy embracing that concept. Let me try to be as clear as I can. And again, once again, there are many different aspects, lenses through which we can look at this. Revelation 18, as I brought out, that there's judgment that comes out of her that brings Babylon's fall. Revelation 17, there's this self-destructive aspect. Revelation 20, Revelation 20 culminates in verse 11 with this scene of the throne of God, from whose face earth and heaven have fled away. So the imagery there is that everything's gone. If you're looking at the picture, the only thing left is the throne of God and the one sitting on the throne, the great white throne, at that point in Revelation. Obviously, John's speaking metaphorically, but the point of the image is the only thing that's focused its attention is the throne of God. How do the dynamics work? I'm not going to venture to say. I think that's, Deuteronomy 29:29. What's revealed is for us and our children, and the hidden things belong to God. So there's whole questions about the fire. Clearly, the fire cleanses the earth, but later on in Revelation 20, the fire is described as the second death. How do we understand all those metaphors? One thing, let's just make sure we're inside the city at that day. That is the most important takeaway for each one of us, is that we become followers of the Lamb. We follow him wherever he goes, and that we don't love our life even when faced with death.
Amen. Here we have like a challenge. It says, Brother Steve, it is possible for you to summarize how Christ and his true followers conquer by laying down life, especially if you could share so simply that even a non-Christian child might be able to understand.
A non-Christian child. I guess the best illustration would be what Jesus described in the Gospel of John, John 12, that if you have a kernel of grain and you keep it by itself, it dies. It only bears life if you plant it in the ground. And so by yielding itself up, it brings greater life and more abundant life. So that would be my illustration. For those that are not children, I would say that the whole concept of conquering is really important in the book of Revelation. So Christ is the Christological noun in the book of Revelation, or the Lamb, and overcome is the Christological verb. It runs throughout the entire book. And that God's people overcome the way the Lamb overcame. And how did the Lamb overcame? He overcame through self-denial and self-sacrifice.
Awesome. We have one more question. This would be the last question, and we go to the giveaway. So don't go. What is God's purpose in executing his wrath?
What's God's purpose in executing wrath? Good question. Again, there is that law of double coming back on someone's head, like we described with Haman and in the book of Deuteronomy. So there's that fulfillment of that. In Babylon is all the blood of all the slain upon all the earth. So that comes back on her. There's a fulfillment of justice there, unquestionably. There's an aspect of mercy. People have put themselves so out of harmony with God that to be in God's presence would be torture to them. Again, a very multifaceted aspect. Clearly, one major thing we need to think through is when we think of Revelation 20, at the very end of Revelation 20, all the questions in the great controversy are finally cleared. Every created being understands that God truly is love and was in no ways responsible for the rebellion or the suffering that's come through it.
Great. We're done with the questions then.
Great. So let's do our little giveaway here.
Yes, we're going to do our giveaway. So I don't know if you guys have you heard about the Conflict Beautiful? It's a beautiful set of all the books of the Great Controversy, Great Conflict?
Conflict of the Ages series.
I remember when I got mine, I put a picture on my Instagram and a friend told me, man, those are like the Apple book versions of Ellen G. White. They're really awesome, beautiful. And we're going to give away 2 of those.
2 sets.
Yeah, 2 sets, a gray set and a Sanctuary version set. So what do you need to do? You just need to go here. Go to outpostcenters.org/giveaway. And if you put your name, last name, and your email, you will enter the draw. So after our last webinar that we're going to have, that it's going to be on Sabbath night, Jesse's going to be talking on that one. We will be executing the draw, and we're going to have 2 winners, one for the gray edition and another one for the Sanctuary edition. So this is a really, really cool book, set of books. They're worth $200, and we will ship them anywhere in the world. We don't know from where you may be, maybe Philippines, Asia, Europe, Africa, maybe an island in Guam. We'll send it anywhere in the world. So put your name, last name, and email there. Now, remember also that you can put your email in the chat in the case that you don't want to go into the giveaway, but I will really tell you to just go to the giveaway because really
Sounds like
nice
a good
books.
deal.
Yeah. If not in the question and answers, you can put your email if you want to get the slides also as well of this presentation. Well, guys, if there's no more questions,
I think our
well, yeah, many
time is
people
up.
were saying that yes, they know the
The conflict
the
series.
conflict series. So, well, guys, personal delivery to Australia, not personal, but we could do it through.
Maybe.
Yeah, depends.
You know, once COVID restrictions are done, maybe we'll take a trip over.
Yeah, if you give us a place to stay, yeah, that would be good. And some touring around Sydney, Melbourne, snorkeling. That would be good. Well, guys, remember to go to the giveaway. Remember that you can talk to us. Go to the booth in the pavilion of Joseph Bates and the exhibit hall. You can chat with us, select a time. If you want to talk personally to Stephen, maybe you have some questions, you can also ask to talk with him and reserve a slot of time. You can see whatever we have. Remember, we are all about serving ministries to thrive. And sometimes a ministry can be also a business that is part of what they do is reaching people so they can know more about Jesus. You want to say something?
I'm just going to say, and tomorrow, Friday at 11 o'clock Eastern time, we're having another webinar, and that is coaching as pastoral care for those that are theologically interested, but also interested in pastoral care. And you'd like to see how the skill set of coaching can improve your leadership, how it can improve your ministries. Please join us 11 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow.
Okay, so they're asking for the giveaway URL. That's it, outpostcenters.org/giveaway. And then after you do the giveaway, you can go to outpostcenters.org and check out what is OCI. Okay, I think that would be it. Everyone's very happy. Yeah, great. Well, guys, see you in the next webinar. Have a great day. Enjoy the global camp meeting. Bye-bye.
Blessings to you.